the University of Dundee's Centre for Anatomy and Human Identification, the History Cold Case team is embarking on a major new investigation.
Ladies, today's case, medieval Norwich. We've got disarticulated remains of at least 17 people.
Using a mobile forensic lab, the team has come to Norwich, where recent archaeological investigations have unearthed a major and chilling new find: the remains of 17 people at the bottom of a medieval well.
Disarticulated, which means we're not looking at single burials, so presumably it's a massed grave.
The bodies include men, women, and young children. The local community needs answers. Who were these people, and how did their remains end up down a well? The possibilities are horrific.
There's some debate as to whether the children were dead when they went down the well.
The investigation will be led by world-renowned forensic anthropologist Professor Sue Black. Dr. Xanthi Mallet will gather historical evidence, while Professor Caroline Wilkinson will rebuild the faces of the dead. And the team is joined by DNA expert Dr. Ian Barnes.
I've got a team that is of world-renowned reputation, so that if we can't crack it, then, you know, who else can?
By forensically retracing events, analysing the scene of death, and reconstructing the identities of two of the skeletons, can we discover what happened to these people?
This is a really unusual situation for us. I think this is really unique.
And ultimately, might this case reveal the unthinkable, that they were killed?
You simply can't breathe because your chest is compressed.
We go back to a shocking period of widespread religious persecution and genocide.
They haven't applied normal Christian tradition, they've completely ignored it.
As the trail reveals new proof about one of the most shameful episodes in British history. The team has been called to the cathedral city of Norwich. While much of the city's heritage remains intact, the medieval site where the skeletons were discovered in 2004 now lies underneath the Chapelfield shopping centre. Inside a mobile forensic unit, local archaeologists lay out the bones. The jumbled remains point to at least 17 individuals. It's thought there are 6 adults, both male and female, but more shockingly, 11 children, aged from just 2 years old. This is one of the most troubling archaeological hauls the team has been presented with. Who were these people? What killed them? And why did their bodies end up at the bottom of a well? Finding out will require the full arsenal of forensic skills. Professor Caroline Wilkinson and Dr. Xanthi Mallet will initiate the investigation, before reporting back to Professor Sue Black at Dundee HQ.
This time round, we go out into the community. So we go down to the site where the bones were found, we talk to the people who were involved, and we look at those bones on that site. We then go and do our analysis, and we come back and we present to the community what it is that we found.
Connecting the skeletons to the context of where they were found is a crucial first step in what promises to be a challenging case. The original excavation was led by archaeologist Giles Emery. He arrives at the mobile lab to bring Xanthi up to speed with the possible theories about this bizarre discovery.
When we first found them, we suspected it could be a plague burial. because that's the kind of thing, a mass burial in an unexpected place.
To test the idea that these were plague victims, they did carbon dating.
We've had 2 carbon dates done. They're actually, we're probably talking 12th to 13th century.
But the dates didn't add up, as the 12th or 13th century is too early for plague. Plus, there's the strange position in which the bodies were found, several metres down in what seems to be an old well. Giles is hoping the team can come up with some new leads to explain this unique find. He takes Xanthi to the exact spot where the bodies were discovered. The shoppers have no idea about the history that lay buried here.
So if we stop about here, well, we're in quite a busy shopping arcade, but to our left here, this is where we found them.
This actual shop?
Yeah, this is the site. 17 people in the bottom of a well shaft.
That sounds unusual to me, but...
Yeah, it's a mass burial, but it's in a well shaft, which, I've not been able to find any parallels
anywhere
in the UK.
Really?
No.
Pictures taken at the time of the excavation seem to indicate that the bodies were thrown down together, head first.
Oh,
now,
wow.
You can see all these skeletal remains.
Yep.
There's actually a leg there that is articulated.
Yeah,
There's a knee there,
that,
and it's actually the wrong way around. It's heading up. If you imagine you drop someone by their ankles down a well, they're going to end up in this kind of slumped position. Below this shot.
But there are still so many unanswered questions.
What I really want to know is it a family group? If it's too early for a plague burial, is it some other endemic disease?
Could be something as simple as flu, though.
Could even be a famine.
Yep.
The other problem I have is what are they doing down a well?
Yeah, that's a bit query.
They're in the parish of St Stephen, literally 100 metres away. There's a cemetery. They didn't make it that far. They were actually placed in a well here. Why? Why were they treated like that?
The mystery has become something of an obsession for Giles.
Yeah, it's one of those things I think about literally like every other week. It'll cross my mind.
Why?
But it's such a... whenever you do a burial, it's a very intimate experience. But to do that many, and then to find out there were so many children as well, it really does make you think. It has, yeah.
Xanthi and Caroline must start the difficult job of making sense of the bones, which they learn also include the puzzling remains of dead cats.
How they fit with this, I've no idea. Pretty sharp, though. This is a bit of a strange mixture, isn't it? It is.
They start with the remains of the children. There are at least 11 individuals, aged from about 15 down to 2 years old.
Skull, and we've got a mandible. Oh, okay, look, we've got some cribiorbitalis, which is these little holes, which is a sign of anemia.
Immediately, they spot marks which could be evidence of poor nutrition. But on this initial visual examination, Xanthi and Caroline find no clear patterns. It will require a full battery of the latest scientific tests to help establish how these people died. The team continues to work into the night. 2 of the skeletons are singled out as good candidates for facial reconstruction. Caroline first scans the fractured skull of one of the children. He or she was 5 to 7 years old.
I think that we've got enough fragments. If they're all from the same individual, we've got enough fragments to do a reconstruction. We'll have to do a little bit of estimation around the mid-face. If they're not all from the same individual, then that will be much more problematic.
She also wants to work on the skull belonging to one of the adult males.
The skull's got interesting features around the nasal bones because they're very large and prominent, suggesting a very large and prominent nose. We've got this level of asymmetry around the eyes. One's much higher and further back than the other. And then we've got strong, what are called supramastoid crests, which are lines above the ear, which suggest that this person had large ears that stuck out from the side of the head. So he's got good characteristic detail in terms of his facial appearance. I'm looking forward to this actually, because it's not often you get such characteristic detail that you notice straight away, so it should be an interesting face.
To begin the laboratory testing, she removes one of his teeth.
So we're going to take this molar and send it for stable isotope analysis, and that should tell us what he ate, what his diet was like, therefore where he came from, and hopefully give us a broader picture of this individual.
The bones will also be tested for DNA and trace chemicals, which could tell us more about who these people were. It's around this barrage of scientific tests that the team will build their investigation. But will they be able to bring identities back to the two skeletons they selected, the man and child? Back in Dundee, Xanthi brings Professor Black up to speed.
I've got a CGI actually which works for you, which is fantastic actually. So this is obviously rows of houses right in the centre, kind of where you'd have your bins out, you know, in the back garden as it were. So the well is right in the middle of this community.
Oh, I don't like going down.
Oh, I know. It makes you want to lean over the edge. So this is obviously showing the shaft of the well, and this is representative of the bottom. I know. Yeah. You can see the soil compacting all of them down into one group. That's great.
A thin layer of soil on top of the bodies means they were deposited at the same time. The obvious first question is, was this foul play?
They could have actually been murdered and put down the well. Are we talking about that type of
disposal?
Event? Exactly.
Well, only if we see any signs of perimortem trauma that would indicate a violent death.
The apparent lack of damage caused around the time of death means they dismiss the idea of murder, for now at least. So is this perhaps a place where the sick or deprived ended up when they died?
So this was a time of kind of hardship in England. You did get famine and things.
There was some signs of anemia, signs in there.
Okay.
Yeah. Or are we talking about some type of disease that's hit the population? The fact that we've got so many children could be dysentery, something like that.
Okay.
Obviously, if a lot of individuals die at the same time, you need to remove them from the population as quickly as possible and get rid of them.
Yeah, you don't really want them hanging around, do you?
The team agrees that poverty and disease are the obvious places to start to look for a cause of death. The remains may yet yield some other crucial information. Geneticist Dr. Ian Barnes takes samples from the long leg bones of 8 of the skeletons, including the adult male and the 5 to 7-year-old child.
Ian is helping us out enormously in terms of the DNA, and Ian has a worldwide reputation in terms of his science. And I don't think I've met anybody who knows more about the subject than he does, but has the ability to convey it in a manner that is really quite straightforward, which is what most of us need when it comes to genetics.
If the people in the well turn out to be related, then this could dramatically change the complexion of the case. But it will be several weeks before the DNA results are back. Meanwhile, to start the historical investigation, Xanthi needs to understand what Norwich was like in the 11 and 1200s. At that time, Norwich was England's second largest city. Its expansion built on its position as a major centre of manufacture and trade. The population had ballooned to over 12,000. But who was living in the immediate area around the well? Xanthi hopes the Norwich Records Office will yield some clues. She meets archivist Susan Maddock, who produces a surprising and rare document from the time.
So this looks exciting.
Yes, this is one of the city court rolls, covers 1287 to 1298.
Is this original?
This is original.
Then I will not touch that. I'll let you unroll it. It's probably as valuable as it looks.
Yes, it certainly is. I mean, obviously, it's unique and irreplaceable.
Okay.
Didn't say that to frighten you.
What's this made from?
Well, it's made from parchment, which is sheepskin. So it's scraped and cleaned and makes a very durable writing surface. So this was the main medium used for records in this country, really until paper became popular in the 14th, 15th centuries.
It's a record of property ownership in 13th century Norwich. Susan is looking for a street name she can trace to near the well.
I just gently unroll it. Now, what we're looking for, yes, in the margin here, we can see this little marginal note that looks like NEDA.
So this is Latin?
This is Latin, yes. And that's pointing out this word here, Needham, Nedham. And I see, looking at a modern reconstruction map of Norwich, which shows the medieval street names, and on this map it's shown as Vicus, which is the Latin for street, de Nedum. So we can see that matches with the Nedum in our deed here.
So this street was originally called Vicus de Nedum?
Yes, or Nedum or Needham Street.
Right. So the block that I'm interested in on here is represented by this area here?
It is,
that right?
Yes, yes.
The document also reveals the occupations of property owners.
I can't help noticing that in this map there are a lot of butchers turning up.
Butcher, merchant. Is there any evidence of tanning or skinning, those kind of industries? Because there were cat bones down the well, kind of mixed in with the human bones. I'm wondering whether we might actually find something on here that would help explain that a little bit.
Well, let's give it a try. I notice there's a skinner down here, and this is only a short distance away from
like 4 doors
your area.
down.
Yes. 1295, we've got John de Sayham,
That would work.
a skinner.
Wow.
And if we actually look at the other side, moving along what's now St Stephen's Street, this diagram here, there are quite a number of tanners in this area towards Horsemarket.
So again, the right time period.
Yes.
So, yeah, these people could have actually been living in or very near the people who ended up down the well. So we're really looking at working class people, aren't we? Which fits with everything else I think I found out.
So, were our people local skinners or tanners? And if so, could their profession offer clues as to a cause of death? Xanthi hits the streets of Norwich's Old Town with local historian Brian Ayres.
Isn't it? It's lovely.
It's very picturesque now, but it would have been distinctly less picturesque in the 12th and 13th centuries. I mean, we're on a street which is next to the river. This is a river which a whole range of industries are using for dye works, for tanners, for skinners.
So the dirtier trades.
The dirtier trades. So all this effluent material is flowing down behind the buildings which would have been stood here.
This could explain the puzzling cat bones in the well, which may be a byproduct of the manufacture of cat skin gloves, highly prized across medieval Europe. This was just one aspect of a widespread skinning and tanning industry, and it was dirty work. Medieval tanners often used human urine and feces collected door to door to soften the leather.
Your life expectancy is probably going to be less in Norwich than it is out in the countryside. Really? Because of the noxious fumes and the poor living conditions, but it will be a shorter life, but probably an economically better one, potentially a better one.
Isn't
and
it?
so one does get people arriving here for that very reason.
It's clear that poor hygiene and harsh working conditions would have made local people vulnerable to serious infection. Back in Dundee, Caroline is ready to start the facial reconstructions.
We've got the skull of the male adult from the Norwich well. You can see the bits that are pale are the pieces of bone that we have, and the green areas are the areas that I've had to estimate. We just had this one piece of missing mandible. So all round, I'm quite interested by this skull. It's got lots of nice characteristic detail.
The shattered skull of the child requires much more work, however.
We've got to put together these fragments before we can do any reconstruction. And what we can do in the computer is we can take one of the pieces. Here we've got part of the forehead, and we can move it so that it's touching the other piece and realign it.
We can put it roughly in the right position and then we can tweak it. So this is our skull when it's been totally reassembled. And those are the areas that have been estimated in green.
Reconstructions of children have their own unique challenges.
It's very difficult to tell whether the individual is male or female when the child is this young. So girls and boys are between the ages of 5 and 7 are indistinguishable facially. We tend to judge the sex of a child in relation to their hairstyle, their clothes that they're wearing, how they're being treated by others around them. We're actually very bad at estimating whether a child is male or female from just the face, especially at this age.
Soon, actual faces will start to emerge as Caroline adds the muscle, skin and features to each reconstruction. With squalid living conditions around the well area and apparent signs of malnutrition on the bones, but no obvious trauma, is disease now the most likely culprit in the story of what happened to these people? And if so, what killed them? The 11 and 1200s marked a time of huge population growth for Norwich, and the sick started to be catered for in new charitable medical centres.
It is, it's amazing. Founded in 1249.
The Great Hospital of Norwich was one of the first of its kind in Britain. Xanthi meets Professor Carol Rawcliffe here, a specialist in medieval health.
I actually have a photograph of one of the specimens I've been looking at. And she's interesting because obviously we've got some of the skeletal markers, we've got the cribripitalia.
That's a sign of iron deficiency, and what's fascinating is that other excavations in Norwich have revealed a very high incidence of this, up to 70% in some cases, among women and children. And what may not be known is that during the Middle Ages and later, malaria is endemic in parts of England, and that also will increase levels of anemia.
Carol thinks it's entirely possible the people in the well died of a then incurable disease, such as malaria, which was rife in the overcrowded city of the 12th and 13th centuries.
It's rather like the developing world today. Here in the city you are encountering diseases and deficiencies which we no longer have to experience. It's likely there could have been an epidemic of influenza, perhaps dysentery, perhaps typhus. It's very hard to tell, but obviously something which is killing people in quite large numbers.
Charitable hospitals had close links to the church, and the sick believed going to hospital could erase their burden of sin. Even the poor could expect to receive medical care. The theory that our people fell victim to disease certainly fits the facts so far. But if 17 people died at the same time, where would they have been buried? Would their bodies have been disposed of in a well? To find out how people were buried during the epidemics which hit Britain in the Middle Ages, Xanthi heads to Bishopsgate in London, once the site of a vast medieval cemetery. No other burials in wells have ever been found in the UK, but under the pavement here is an extraordinary site called the Charnel House, where hundreds of bodies have been excavated from deep shafts. The way people were laid to rest here might offer vital clues.
Hello, Chris.
Hi.
Man behind the wall.
Welcome to the Charnel House.
Fantastic. Oh, should we go out the rain?
If you come in this way.
Chris Thomas from the Museum of London excavated this site, which was used for a huge number of mass burials.
This Charnel House sits in the middle of a cemetery that we excavated about 10,500 skeletons from.
Wow.
And it was in use from around about 1150 till 1540. And it's a cemetery that's associated with a medieval hospital. Most of the people are buried in individual graves, but we had thousands of people buried in mass burial pits.
Right.
And a whole series of shafts with people buried on top of each other.
And what you find, generally speaking, even in Black Death burial grounds, any sort of emergency burial ground, that people are usually buried in a Christian manner. So you can see from some of the burials that we had, even in our mass burial pits, the skeletons are still being laid out on their back with their head at the west end, their feet at the east.
Okay, so even in mass burials, the placement of the body is still really important.
It is. So the myth that people are thrown off the back of carts into pits in the Black Death simply isn't true.
So if I just show you some of the pictures from my site, you may get a better idea. Now this is a well shaft, and you can see they're all completely intermixed. This just looks like almost like rubbish thrown away, all mixed up, no care.
Yeah, I think the difference is absolutely fundamental. Whoever's dealt with this, they haven't applied normal Christian tradition, they've completely ignored it.
What Xanthi learns from the charnel house makes the well burial even more confusing. Even during the worst outbreaks of disease, people were not just thrown into the nearest hole. The church taught that to be buried in a non-Christian way would lead to purgatory and hell. Medieval Norwich was a devout Christian city with over 40 parish churches. So, why weren't our 17 people buried with the usual care? Could it be because they weren't Christians?
This is not a Christian burial. So that do we have people who are not of the Christian faith? Is that why they're there? Or is it that they are some form of an outcast? Was it that people were afraid of them? I don't know, but they were not dealt with respect.
The stable isotope data are back, and the results are intriguing. What they reveal is that the people found down the well had lived in the local area for many years. They were not just visiting. The trail suddenly now points towards non-Christian locals. And there's only one significant community from the time that matches that profile. Since 1135, Norwich was home to a thriving Jewish community, living just a few hundred yards from the well site. Xanthi meets up with Sophie Cabot, a specialist in Norwich's Jewish history, to find out more about this community.
The Jewry in Norwich in the Middle Ages was in this position between the market and the castle. Right. The castle's just up there, obviously the market's behind us, and the properties owned by Jews were concentrated in the area from White Lion Street here, right up to Little Orford Street at the far end of this block.
Is the proximity of the Jewry to the castle important?
It is, yeah. I mean, Norwich is a royal castle.
Right.
They were in England at the invitation of the Crown.
Oh, I see.
And the Crown had direct legal control over them and their business.
The Jews of Norwich had a very specific role.
And why were they actually invited here by the king?
They were invited to lend money.
And that was that primary function?
Yeah. At the time, the Christian interpretation of the Bible didn't allow Christians to lend money at interest. It was a sin called usury. Certainly, that's something that's not forbidden in Jewish law. So cash finance for big projects of any sort came from Jewish financiers.
Almost like banks?
Yeah, like banks, basically.
Does that mean they were all wealthy then?
Some of them were extremely wealthy. There's one or two families who are incredibly rich and who are lending money on a national scale or even an international scale.
Xanthi and Sophie visit the house of Isaac Jernet, which still stands in central Norwich. Despite having financed the cathedral, like many Jews across Christian Europe, the Jernets may have been subject to persecution.
This is him here, shown at the top.
With a crown?
Wearing a crown, yes, showing how important he is, and also with three profiles, three faces. It seems to mean that he's into everything, that he's sort of got fingers in lots of pies.
Oh, I see.
And this is a caricature. This was drawn by a Christian, by a scribe in the Exchequer. They, as you can see, have rather caricatured faces, big noses. This is a hat that indicates that Moses is Jewish. They're not kind drawings.
No.
And they're shown with this little devil who is tweaking them on the nose.
Would you say that it's anti-Semitic? Because it's certainly not complimentary.
There's resentment of the fact that Jews are making money. Some Jews, like Isaac, are making a huge amount of money, and they're doing it in a way that doesn't involve physical labour or things that are necessarily recognised as work. You know, it's a bit like people feel about bankers now.
But Sophie thinks it's unlikely the skeletons in the well came from the Jewish community. On the site of the old synagogue, Sophie explains how they would have taken as much care over burial as Norwich's Christians.
You would want it to be quick, so you would be ideally buried within 24 hours of your death. You would want it to be very simple, so you would be washed and wrapped in a shroud. It's quite a simple ceremony, but it's got to be done right and in a dignified way.
Well, you've kind of preempted my other question then. So you don't think that the Jewish community would have put other Jewish individuals in the well?
No, I don't. I think it's pretty much impossible. I think if there were any Jews in the community to see that the dead got a proper burial, that's what they would do.
If the bodies in the well were Jewish, this would point to foul play. It would suggest that their burial was deliberately careless or rushed. We know that across Britain and Europe at this time, Jewish people were increasingly victims of vicious hate attacks. Could this be what happened to our 17 people in Norwich? The DNA analysis is now complete. Aware that the case now risks grinding to a halt, the team hopes the results will provide a new lead.
So how many did we take DNA samples from out of the, 17?
I think we sampled 8 different individual...
From children through to adults?
Yeah, we're trying to get a range
Well, the
scenario.
DNA will perhaps not only tell us about family, but if there is any other connection, genetic type connection, you know, in a tight-knit group, then Ian might be able to tell us something about that as well. So, fingers crossed for DNA.
Yeah.
Where our money's on DNA.
They call Dr. Ian Barnes.
There we are.
Okay, we've
Hello.
got you now. Hi. We are looking today at medieval Norwich. We're hoping, against all hope, that you'll have something interesting to tell us.
No pressure.
Okay, so some pretty interesting news with this card.
Oh, good!
Okay, so we actually got 8 samples.
Yeah.
Of the 8, one of them looks like there might be some contamination, or maybe it's heavily damaged in some way.
Okay.
So we'll disregard that one. The remaining 7, one of them has a very generic, standard European DNA type.
Okay.
One of them has a DNA type which is relatively uncommon across Europe, but it's still just a generic European kind of sequence.
Okay.
The other 5, however, have the same mitochondrial DNA
Cool.
sequence. So it looks like the 5 that have the same sequence, you could maybe assume or infer that they are directly internally related, yeah.
Right.
Remarkably, 5 of the people down the well were related to each other. But that's not all the DNA results reveal.
Now, the more unusual thing is that there are sequences belong to a group which is relatively unusual in Europe. It occurs at about something like 6%, but it's a very high frequency, more like over 30% in Ashkenazi Jewish populations.
Wow, that's interesting.
That's
strong
just
evidence,
amazing.
isn't it?
So that's for how many individuals?
5.
So that's 5 that we're
of them.
happy with.
It's an unexpected breakthrough in the case. The science has shown that at least 5 of the people down the well were from the Jewish community, and likely family members.
This is a really unusual situation for us. I think this is a really unique set of data that we've been able to get for these individuals. I'm not aware that this has been done before, that we've been actually able to pin them down to this level of specificity about the ethnic group that they seem to come from.
That's a good result. That's phenomenal. Thank you so much indeed. Bye.
Bye-bye.
I think what Ian has told us is truly amazing.
It is.
In that we clearly have family members. We've got a recognised group.
And this is really pointing to something, the most tragic of all of those options as well, with 11 children.
11 children
and 6
of a
adults.
common maternal
Closely
DNA.
linked.
The story now looks set to take a much darker turn.
There is a real temptation, I think, to go down the route of saying, because we've recognised the group, because we know they're a family, we're looking at something that's possibly more macabre, that we're looking at persecution. What we haven't yet got is the cause of death, or causes of death. I think we probably should go back to some of the bones and just have a look, because I'm concerned that we haven't got any form of a trauma. I mean, dropping down the well would cause trauma, and the prospect that, you know, maybe someone's gone down that well alive,
especially kids,
is horrendous.
Sue's previous experience leads her to believe this could now be a case of mass murder.
We're possibly talking about persecution, we're possibly talking about ethnic cleansing. And this all brings to mind very much the scenario that we dealt with during the Balkans war crimes. In terms of the brutality of the ethnic cleansing, it was felt that, you know, women and children, quite frankly, weren't worth wasting the bullet on. So that women were quite often bayoneted, for example. Pregnant women were bayoneted because that way you got rid of a woman because that wasn't important, and you got rid of the next generation because you really didn't want them to survive. So I know what sort of patterns I'm looking for if it was the same sort of situation where these individuals thrown down the well alive, where these individuals killed before they went down the well.
With this new question in mind, Sue goes back to the bones again to examine the legs and spinal columns in minute detail, and on one of the adults makes a crucial new discovery.
If you open up and look at the surface of the 12th thoracic, you can see that we've got what looks like a burst fracture, and it's coming over onto the surface here at the side and coming over onto the front there. That kind of thing happens when you get force either coming down onto legs or, of course, coming down onto head, so that what you're getting is a twisting, because that's what happens. You get a twisting, and the edge of one vertebra causes the fracture on the body. So the column is twisting, and as you impact, then what you get is the burst fractures.
And there is similar damage to 3 of the adult leg bones.
When we look particularly at these 3 bones, what we've got are radiating fracture lines passing up there, and we've got little stepped areas of cortex there with a little fracture coming. Those again look like they're going to be perimortem. All of these indicating that what we have are individuals where we have trauma to the extended leg. So whether it's going down, it must be landing on feet, because you're getting, or landing on knees, of course it could be, but it's certainly trauma of force of impact. If you were falling into water, then I wouldn't expect to find this fracturing. I simply wouldn't, because once you hit the water surface, then you've got almost like a cushioning, if you like. These are fractures that I suspect are about landing on a hard surface.
Sue believes this new evidence shows the well was actually dry, and the adult victims were either killed just before or died very shortly after being thrown down the well.
If they're down at the bottom of the well, and these are the adults, then the children, where we're seeing no trauma, may well have been thrown in on top of them. So we're not going to see perimortem fracturing as such with them, because they're landing on a cushion of these adults.
It's an alarming possible sequence of events. So, what would a modern homicide detective make of the circumstances of this case? Xanthi meets up with forensic pathologist Stuart Hamilton in Norwich Castle, which still has an intact well shaft.
That's a long way, isn't it?
That's a deep well, yes.
Somebody falling in there, or being pushed, whatever.
Yes.
Are they going to survive that?
They're not going to survive that fall. If the simple impact at the bottom doesn't kill them outright, then the deceleration is going to tear arteries, it's going to damage organs, you're going to bleed to death fairly rapidly.
I mean,
even if you don't die straight away. You're not going to be alive for long.
What would you say if this were a forensic case presented to you, 17 people in a well, what would be your reading of it?
One person in a well like that, to me, is something that's worrying. 2 people is very worrying. 17 people it's a mass grave.
Would I put a slightly different slant on this in your opinion if I were to tell you that all of the individuals were from a minority group?
I think it's almost just common sense, really. This is saying that it is a particular group which seems to have been targeted. In this sort of case, it's the accumulation of the evidence. It's not just one piece or the other piece. It's, as it all builds up more and more and more, you simply can't ignore all of these things coming together.
And he feels the lack of fatal trauma on all of the bones does not rule out murder.
It's not uncommon that you can get homicides where there really would be nothing left on the bones. Relatively recently, I've dealt with a case where there was a homicidal knife assault with neck wounds, arteries were damaged, but no bony injuries at all.
Stewart explains another cause of death that leaves no marks, but may fit with so many people being thrown down a narrow well.
The average adult human weighs 70 kilograms, and that amount of pressure pressing down on you with multiple people, it's going to compress your chest. There is a well-recognised phenomenon that's called crush asphyxia, where you simply can't breathe because your chest is compressed, and that could be by a wall that's fallen on you, but it could be by a pile of human beings. And some of the disasters with the football stadia, people crushed against fences, you simply can't move your chest because it's crushed so tightly, and it doesn't really bear thinking about in some ways.
What's your gut instinct as to what happened?
For these people's sake, what I hope happened was that they had their throats cut, that they were strangled, that they died a quick death and their bodies were disposed of. I fear that they were simply thrown down the well and left to die.
It seems horrific. But if we're looking at 17 people who knew each other, perhaps even mothers, fathers, sons and daughters, then what events could have led to this? When Jewish people first moved to Britain following the Norman conquest of 1066, many settling in the key cities of London, Norwich and York, they enjoyed the protection of the crown. But just a few generations later, the story was very different. In England, protection wavered after Richard the Lionheart's coronation in 1190, and right across Europe, anti-Semitic propaganda was growing. Jews were accused of spreading plague, poisoning the water in wells, and even of using the blood of Christians in their rituals. But were our people somehow caught up in this? Xanthi travels to Bevis Marks in London, the oldest surviving synagogue in the country, to see Jewish historian Miri Rubin.
You're aware by now that the DNA has come back and it's indicating that we're looking at a Jewish population. What does that mean to you?
The first reaction is just shock. It's just, the mind boggles, at least 17 people, so many children, so many really young children amongst them. Well, it's just a horrific thought that, with all the research, these sort of events can just go unnoticed. There are new types of dangers that develop in the late 12th, 13th centuries, new nasty narratives. You might even say that as Europe becomes more Christian, there is a real deepening of the sort of the sense of Jewish evil. So that it is, I'm afraid, a picture of worsening and ultimately the age of expulsions, where England leads in 1290, where the Jews are expelled back to where they came from, to northern France.
Yeah. So was that the kind of pinnacle of the unrest, the expulsion?
You might say so. It's the king brought them in and the king kicked them out sort of thing.
But Miri doesn't think they could have been part of the recorded acts of violence against Jews. nor the organised expulsion of Jews from England and Wales of 1290.
I see no reason that the bodies will not have been relinquished to the Jewish community to bury properly, nor indeed would I think that children would have been involved so conspicuously, nor bodies that seem unbroken, undisturbed, unmutilated, like the ones that we've found. That's the problem.
She believes this points to another less well-known incident in the 1230s.
Another flashpoint that occurred to me is the 1230s. The 1230s that saw, on a number of occasions, violence in the streets of Norwich against Jews, and indeed, and very important for this case, a burning of some Jewish houses by Norwich people, because that would then suggest that maybe they died in their sleep from the inhalation of smoke, and thus they suffocated, because that would explain both the existence of the children and the fact that their bodies are not sort of mutilated in a way that you'd expect if it was just sort of real violence in the street and they were just felled.
What's clear is that during this time the Jews of Norwich could not rely on any protection from the Crown.
It's evident that royal officials, the sheriff and his bailiff, simply lost control of the city and indeed became the subject. The bailiffs were actually beaten up by Norwich people. So that suggests to me a situation where this system of control and scrutiny and protection that was painstakingly laid down over the decades had actually been disrupted in those years, and actually royal officials could not contain what was unfolding.
How many Jewish people were actually in Norwich at this time?
Maybe 150 to 200 or so.
17 people then is actually quite a large proportion of this. You know, you think 17, within a community, it's not that many, but this is massive, isn't it?
Really, really big. And the fact these are families and children, this is a very, very big deal.
This puts a totally new complexion onto the facial reconstructions, now nearing completion.
So this is our Jewish group from the well in Norwich, and we've got adult male and young unidentified child in terms of sex. We don't know if it's a boy or a girl, 5 to 7 years old.
First, there is the adult male in his 40s.
So the first thing that we'll look at in terms of characteristics are his ears, because we know that he's got adherent ears. In other words, he hasn't got any lobes. The ears just hit the straight onto the side of the head. And the bones around the mastoid process suggest that he had quite prominent ears, both upper and lower prominence.
Then there is the 5 to 7 year old child, who could be related to the man.
And we've added the muscle structure over and above the skull, and now we can look at some of the feature detail. Much more difficult with children because we don't have the strong features that we can take with adults. So most children tend to have similar small upturned noses, and the adult nose shape won't develop until after the age of 8 is when it starts to develop.
And Caroline has discovered evidence which backs up the idea that they are family members.
Now, interestingly, with this particular individual, he or she also had adherent ears, which means that the child didn't have lobes, which is similar to the adult. The adult is showing that feature too. We know it's an hereditary feature, so if you have adherent ears, then one of your parents will have adherent ears as well. So the fact that they both have adherent ears, I think, is significant.
The final task will be to apply likely skin, hair and eye colour. Did our man and child die from smoke inhalation when their houses were set fire to? Did they die once in the well from crush asphyxia? Or is there still another scenario which could explain the lack of fatal trauma on the bones? Xanthi has come to Clifford's Tower in York to take part in an annual service commemorating a very different sequence of events, which led to the tragic loss of many Jewish lives.
In March 1190, about 150 Jews, men, women and children, sought protection in the royal castle here, now known as Clifford's Tower, where they could usually rely on royal protection. The Sheriff of Yorkshire decided to order the ejection of the Jews from the castle, and the families inside deciding that the end had come, followed the tradition of heroic martyrdom, that they should take their own lives rather than die at the hands of the mob. The father of each household killed his own family and was then killed by the rabbi.
The suicide method, taking a knife to their throats, may well not have left a mark on the bones, and would also fit with the idea that the people in the well are family members. It's a tragic possibility.
It really hits home that I've seen some people who may have lived in a very similar situation, may have died in a similar way, and it really humanises the whole story and tells me about what Norwich may have been like. We've seen it in York. Was it the same in Norwich?
The team has reached the end of this investigation. The first examination of the bones took place in the depths of winter. It's now spring, and after months of work, it's time for the story these bones have told to be relayed back to the local community. Sue, Caroline and Xanthi return to Norwich and the medieval Guild Hall. Keen to hear their findings are those who originally excavated the site, experts who have assisted the investigation, and members of the local community.
I think a lot about it, actually. Yeah, it almost haunts me a bit because it was such an unusual thing for me, and quite morbid in a way. But also, I'd just like to know a bit more about them.
To actually be able to put a face to one of these characters and actually bring the person to life, it'll be, I think, the most interesting for me.
I should be, interested to find out what we've been able to tell about them, because they're a bit of a mystery.
But how will the people of Norwich react to a story that brings back to life one of the city's darkest hours?
What we have started to do by bringing the science into this investigation is to allow us to look at the story from a different perspective. Why were they in a well? Were they alive or were they dead when they were placed in the well? And how do they fit into the history of Norwich at the time as we know it?
Sue details some of the major twists that the investigation took, starting with the idea of disease.
So it's not leprosy, it's not TB, it's not something that leaves a skeletal lesion, but that doesn't rule out all of the enteric diseases.
But there was the stumbling block of unchristian burial.
The most important thing is, even though they died in vast numbers, they were still buried with the observance of Christian rites.
And then the dramatic science that pushed the trail towards murder.
So we need to talk about a real turning point, the point at which this investigation really did take a very, very different direction. We have to talk DNA. So we sent some bones off to Ian to have a look at the DNA. Out of the 5 of them where there was retrievable good information, what we have is a situation where the mitochondrial DNA, which is the DNA that's transferred down through a maternal line, effectively matches. So we have family members. That was really important, but what was even more important was that the DNA told us that the most likely group to which these individuals belong are in fact Jewish.
Wow. Wow, I'm actually quite shocked about that.
Well, you weren't the only one. If it's not a natural death, then I have to go back to where I was in Kosovo and to say, are we looking at a non-natural death? Are we looking at a murder scenario?
Everyone is shocked at the idea that the people of Norwich once participated in the Europe-wide Jewish persecution.
Usually this is the nice bit for everybody, where I reveal a face, but it doesn't feel that way today. So let me first show you our male adult face.
lovely face.
Caroline's second reconstruction is even more emotive. One of the 11 children from the well.
I think our child is just beautiful as well.
It's perfect to he or she. They're just perfect.
I think they're very... Well, they're all a bit emotive now, actually.
Yeah.
We know what we might be looking at here is father and son, or father and daughter, or uncle and niece, or uncle and nephew, etc.
But a familial bond of some sort. And those might still be skeletons, but these are now people.
It's a shocking revelation for everyone involved.
It's very sad for Norwich. It changes the story of what we know about this community. You know, we don't know everything about this community, but what we thought we knew is changed by this, yeah.
No, it was a big surprise, really. It's not what I was expecting at all. I knew that we were going to learn something, and I really didn't think it was going to go in that direction.
We had an idea that they died horribly, but the thought that it could be self-inflicted possibly is rather upsetting.
From what started out as a mysterious jumble of unidentified remains, we can now say that at least 5 of the people in the well were Jewish. We know that the children could likely have been from the same extended family or community, and tragically, that the trail points to them having possibly been murdered or pushed into suicide. This story throws new light on the horrific spate of persecution that ran through medieval England, which saw Jews used for their money, forced to remain social outcasts, and ultimately left without protection from the angry mob. The bones will now be handed back, perhaps for eventual reburial.
Do you know, today was hard. I don't think I quite expected it to be as hard as it was. And it's how I feel every single time I have to talk to families today when we bring the news. And in forensic anthropology, the news that we bring is always bad news. It's the news that says, I'm sorry, your son's dead, your mother's dead, and you have to deal with the emotion. We were bringing the information to a community that was going to be seriously affected and seriously challenged by what we were going to say. But I knew that what we weren't doing was bringing closure. We were bringing almost the opposite. We were opening wounds that people were going to have to address.
At the University of Dundee's Centre for Anatomy and Human Identification, the History Cold Case team is about to embark on a remarkable new investigation.
We have got 113 skeletons, all male, signs of unusual conditions. We're not talking about 1 or 2 skeletons, we're talking about hundreds. So it's a very big story.
The case will be led by forensic anthropologist Professor Sue Black. Dr. Xanthi Mallet will gather historical evidence, while Professor Caroline Wilkinson will rebuild the faces of the dead. In York, more than 100 skeletons have been found in 10 mass graves. It's an extraordinary archaeological find and the biggest case the team has ever had to deal with. Why did so many people die here?
It's very, very unusual.
I've never seen a grave like that, to be honest with you.
The trail will transport us back 350 years to one of the most traumatic and pivotal events in British history.
You just lunge forward straight into the faces of the enemy there.
To a time when medical intervention could be as dangerous as life on the battlefield.
If I take it off at the shoulder, the chances are you will die.
When men believed they were caught up in Armageddon.
They thought that they were fighting in the last battle between Christ and the forces of Antichrist.
And to one man's surprising story.
Oh boy, that is outrageous.
That will not only change our views on how the English Civil War was fought, but provide a unique window into the birth of democracy itself. In the heart of York, the History Cold Case team has set up its mobile forensic unit, near where the remains of 113 people were recently excavated. This is the biggest case the team has ever taken on. Members of the local archaeological community lay out a selection of remains from 10 mass graves, discovered in 2008 just beyond the city walls. Every single skeleton is male. But there are also the boxed remains of 2 further bodies that have especially troubled archaeologists since excavation. Their bones show signs of puzzling abnormalities. Why did 113 men end up buried together? And what's the truth behind the disfigured bodies?
There's a lot of dead people here, and so there needs to be an explanation for why you've got so many in one place. Every single one of those people will have a story. Some of them are going to have a really interesting story to tell.
Professor Sue Black and Dr. Xanthi Mallet fly in from Dundee HQ. Together they will carry out a preliminary examination of the recovered bones.
There's a lot here.
Immediately, they find many signs of healed trauma and bone breaks.
Oh, look, there's a problem in the elbow. Whether it's a dislocation, it's really hard to dislocate that joint, though. Really, really hard to dislocate it. It looks as if there's a bit of remodelling going on at the wrist. I wonder if that's a previous fracture.
And there are signs of serious infections.
Oh, ho, ho. Look at this. Ouch.
Look at the amount of bone that's been laid down.
That is nasty.
That's very nasty. That's very painful for the time that it's been active.
Which
Whether
is a
it's still
while,
active or not, I don't know. It's a lot of bone being laid down. That's infective. You know, you've got nerve endings that are inflamed. You've got the pus formation. Oh, it's just not nice at all.
Literally, look, it goes all the way through. And there's like.
But it's localised. A simple course of antibiotics today, and that's gone.
Yeah.
Yet all the bones are of strong, young and middle-aged men.
I think we're looking at male, quite well-defined chin.
Quite robust.
Yeah, I'm okay with that.
With no obvious cause of death.
They've got previous fractures and they've got trauma associated with their previous life. But why did they die?
Don't know.
There's no evidence of a cause of death on here
not on any of them.
either. There's no obvious disease process. There's no obvious trauma process. There's nothing. So whatever killed him may have killed them, but it hasn't left a mark.
We're not seeing it.
And there's lots and lots of things that don't leave a mark.
They turn their attention to the 2 boxes that the archaeologists have marked out as being particularly strange. Inside the first, the skeleton of an incredibly muscular male, at first glance consistent with the rest of the group.
We're talking about quite a big, robust adult. But I tell you what I think is interesting is that clavicle's being bound down onto there really, really tightly. So there's huge muscle mass going on up here.
And this is pretty robust as well.
It's not only robust, what you've also got within that bone is a huge amount of torsion.
You can see
because
it's
you
twisted.
can see, and that's the muscle attaching onto there.
You can actually
that's
see
just
the movement, can't you,
trying
by
to
mechanics.
get more of a grip.
Yeah.
So he's very well built.
But he has one highly unusual feature that sets him apart.
Oh, wow.
His hand bones are fused together.
Okay, see, that's interesting. Okay, I'll tell you why that's interesting, because that is a congenital fusion of the carpals, congenital carpal fusion. Really, really rare. But there's not going to have been much in the way of disability. You know, all you're losing is a little bit of movement like that. So, you know, his little finger gets stuck out there. It doesn't ever come across here.
Then there is the final set of remains for Sue and Xanthi to examine.
Oh!
This man has an even more dramatic bone defect.
Oh my.
Okay.
Well.
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 Oh, this is very, very, very unusual.
His elbow and knee are both fused. The bones have grown together. To Sue, this does not look like the trauma found on the other bodies.
Oh boy. You know, it could be so many things. If you take the left limb, so there's the humerus sitting like that, fused at right angles at the elbow, but look how it's fused.
And the fused knee joint is even more debilitating.
I have to say, that is outrageous.
That is a very odd angle.
But look at that buttress that you've got on here.
So muscle.
Huge amount of muscle that's
So this is not a waste. You're not talking somebody who is kind of wasting and not moving.
Right. Functionally, that would be better if it was fused.
Of course,
vertical.
Straight. Yeah.
Sue has found what she thinks might be a rare congenital condition in two different men. Her first thought, could they be related?
That is the singularly most unusual set of carpal coalitions that I have ever seen. And right next door to it is the most outrageous fusion of an elbow at 90 degrees and a knee at 90 degrees. I'd really like to know if they're related.
Yeah.
The condition suffered by these two men is entirely unexpected, given the nature of the rest of the group.
He has a distinct disability. A distinct disability.
It's now a twofold investigation. Firstly, the group as a whole, over 100 men. Who were they and what killed them all? But also, what is the story of these two men with their dramatically fused bones?
The evidence at the moment, if we were looking at this in a purely cold light of day forensic scenario, is we have two individuals, male, of mature age, adult males, who have got congenital abnormalities, or we suspect them to be. We can't make any other link at this stage. But watch the space.
Testing gets underway immediately, including DNA sampling, CT scanning, isotopic analysis, and carbon dating.
So what I'm going to do now is take some samples of this femur, which is the right leg bone of the male with the strange development. I'm going to take two different samples. One's going to be used for the stable isotopes, looking at the provenancing, possibly telling us about diet and maybe where they were. The other one's going to be used for dating the sample, so that's going to really pin down when these people died.
The team will need to wait some weeks for the results to come back. In the meantime, Xanthi needs to gather evidence from the area. So next morning she meets local archaeologist Graham Bruce, who supervised the excavations. Graham had been excavating a site just 100 yards or so outside York's city walls, defences that have stood since Roman times.
Okay, here we are. This is the site where we found all the mass graves.
Back in the Middle Ages, there was a church on this site, and Graham expected to find a traditional medieval graveyard. but instead he was shocked to uncover large pits containing the bodies of over 100 men.
We've got some pictures of the graves themselves in here. See on this one, where you've got...
And they're all lined up?
They're lined up within the graves.
Where were the mass graves within here?
They were predominantly within the church itself, respecting the main wall lines. So the walls must have still been standing, at least partially, when the graves were cut into.
The mass graves were dug inside the church, and Graham believes this must have happened sometime after records show it fell into ruins in the 1580s. And Graham also believes the graves must date from before the 1700s.
By the 18th century in York as well, you've got better cartographic sources, and the maps show this area as open agricultural land with no other buildings on it. So you haven't got anywhere you'd be wanting to put a major 18th century burial ground here.
Carbon dating will confirm whether Graham's theory is correct. But if the mass graves do date from around the 1600s, what does Graham think could be the cause?
Looking at the actual way in which they've been buried, what are your theories on this?
When we started finding mass graves, you do start obviously trying to work out why. It's clearly a major, fairly cataclysmic event that has created all these people dying at the same time. And in the mid-17th century, you have the English Civil War.
Graham's theory is that these bodies could have been victims of the English Civil War. With no women and children amongst the group, could they in fact have been soldiers? Dating back to one of Britain's most brutal and savage periods of conflict. Back at Dundee HQ, Xanthi and Sue get Professor Caroline Wilkinson up to speed, using computer graphics of the burial site and the two most curious bodies.
Now, what you can see here is the church.
The church was in ruins when they were buried.
Church was in ruins, I understand. Okay.
So after
but they've
1580s.
observed the lines of the ruins.
Yes.
I understand.
Yeah. And these are our two individuals.
But not treated any differently. I mean, they're buried in exactly the same way.
Exactly the same way.
Okay.
Such a lot of them. 113.
You can say the number really quickly, but then when you actually see it, it looks like an awful lot of people.
And somebody's taken care putting them all in like that. We'll be getting carbon dates, but we don't have those yet, so obviously they're going to help us pinpoint it. But really we're looking at the Civil War simply because of where they are, and also the number of people in that type of demographic of population. So we'll know more, but this is quite helpful contextually.
The team agrees that the obvious starting place for the larger investigation is to gather more details on the Civil War and how it might have affected the city of York.
I'm absolutely happy that, you know, we can explain it in terms of a potential military, because that fits, that you've got a lot of men of fighting sort of age together.
And how is it the man with severely fused knee and elbow came to be buried amongst what could be a group of soldiers?
We've got a lot more to find out about this guy. I suppose what he would have been doing in this population for a start.
Yeah. Because he's disabled.
Yeah, absolutely. There's no getting away from the fact that he's got a physical disability.
What does a disabled man do in military services? And like the others, he was strong sites of muscle attachment, so he was active.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
It's a big story. Even thinking about the occupations that he might have been involved in, it was really quite exciting, because why on earth is he buried with all these men who I suspect, you know, are relatively healthy, if you can be when you're dead, but, you know, relatively healthy young men of fighting age, perhaps in a military background. What's he doing there?
Professor Caroline Wilkinson is going to reconstruct the faces of the two men with the puzzlingly fused bones. She starts with the man in his early 40s with just the fused hand.
Might be a nasal bone. Excellent. So we've got quite a prominent nose, but it doesn't look underdeveloped.
At this early stage, this man's face seems unaffected by his bone condition, though Caroline spots something that will affect his appearance.
He's lost one of his front teeth at the top, and that's before he died, so it's well healed.
This appears consistent with him being a soldier.
Losing your front incisors is something that's common with people who fight. The teeth next to it look pretty healthy. They're not showing signs of decay, so maybe it being knocked out would be the most likely option.
But what of the more severely affected man with fused elbow and knee?
Looks significantly younger. That's frontal bone, very pronounced frontal bossing. So in other words, this brow ridge, very male characteristic. Big nasal bones there, similar to the last man.
And with this skull, there are possible signs of abnormal bone development.
Goes there. So yeah, the height of the orbit looks very small. That is quite a short distance as well between the nose and the mouth. It's going to be really interesting to put this all together to see what happens to the rest of the face.
Caroline scans in the fractured pieces of both skulls using a 3D laser scanner. Final rebuilding will happen using computer software. Then the full effects of any disorder on their faces will start to emerge. But how did these 2 men and 111 others end up in mass graves in York? And how involved was the city in the Civil War? The First English Civil War was fought from 1642 to 1646, when supporters of Parliament rebelled against the tyrannical rule of King Charles I. At the outset, England was divided, with parliamentarian forces controlling the south and the north under royalist control. York was seen as the key to controlling the entire north of England. And historical records recount that in the spring of 1644, parliamentary forces pushed north and laid siege to the city. So, what impact did this have on York and its population? High up on the city's walls, Xanthi meets Civil War historian Martin Bennett.
Who was fighting?
Well, inside the city you've got the Royalist army of the Earl of Newcastle, about 4,000 of his soldiers inside the city.
So this side, where we are?
Yeah.
Okay. Who's outside?
Outside are 3 parliamentarian armies. When all 3 armies are gathered around, there are about 30,000 at the most.
But surely it would be easy then to take the city with 30,000 men.
There are 2 ways of taking a city. One is by storm and the other is to starve it out. Both of them carry their risks, and parliamentarians initially attempt to starve the garrison out.
But that wasn't going to be easy. It seems that the royalist soldiers had swept up all crops from the surrounding areas and were well prepared.
The people inside, in York, it's not as bad as it could be. They don't get to the stage of eating dogs and cats and rats, because there's plenty of food, plenty of water, plenty of breweries in town making beer, which is, of course, safer to drink than water. And effectively, they have enough to survive the 11 weeks of this siege.
30,000 parliamentarian soldiers spent 3 months camped outside the city walls. It seems that this was the critical moment for York's involvement in the Civil War. Were our 113 part of this besieging force? Amazingly, the siege is particularly well documented. At nearby King's Manor, Martin talks Xanthi through who took part.
Inside you've got the Earl of Newcastle's troops.
With the royalists retreating inside the walls, parliamentarian forces gathered around the city.
What happens first is that the Scots arrive in this area, between the Ouse as it flows into the city and the Ouse as it flows out. So all of this sector here is occupied by Scots forces, and Fairfax's forces occupy this side from the Ouse here right round to the River Foss. What then happens is, towards the end of May, is the Earl of Manchester's army arrives, and occupies the northern territory.
So they kind of
now
spread out
the
now.
city is completely ringed.
Yeah.
And as soon as that is achieved, then they begin to move inwards on the walls. So the suburbs begin to fall into the hands of Parliament.
And Martin has a theory about which of these armies our men could have come from.
Fairfax's forces begin to take over the suburbs outside Walmgate.
Aha, so does that mean that our mass grave is over here?
It's in this area here.
Right, okay, that is close,
Not
isn't
far
it?
from the city walls.
Yeah.
Martin believes our men could have been soldiers from one very particular part of the parliamentarian army, 6,000 men under the command of Lord Fairfax. It's remarkable progress so early in the case, but it will take the results from the isotope testing to tell the team exactly where our soldiers came from. But what of the injuries to the bones Sue and Xanthi saw in the forensic tent? Are these consistent with soldiers fighting in the Civil War? Xanthi goes to Heslington Hall, where Lord Fairfax set up his camp during the siege. She meets Graham Webb and Richard Hawes from the Sealed Knot to learn about the weaponry, roles and injuries typical of 17th century warfare.
So here we have muzzle-loading musket, okay? Mainly used for firing a lead ball.
Yep.
It was inaccurate, so you're unlikely to actually hit anybody with it, although that's no comfort to anybody that's
No.
standing in front of it.
No.
Although there are no signs of musket ball damage on our men's bones, Richard thinks the musket could still be responsible.
Occasionally somebody would get hit and you'd get a horrific smash injuries and your friends would perhaps be falling down next to you.
Yeah.
Eventually the morale of the group that you were firing at would perhaps break and they would run. And at which point you turn it round the other way and you go chasing after them. And this is the real damage that is done with the butt end of the musket.
But how would this have actually worked in practice?
Richard thinks a musket used this way round could be responsible for leg breaks, dislocated elbows and broken clavicle bones in the shoulder. These are exactly the kind of injuries Xanthi and Sue saw on the remains in the tent. But what of the large muscle attachments also found on the bones? Could this be explained by another weapon commonly used by soldiers of the time? The pike.
The biggest and heaviest men carried these, right?
Oh, God.
Now, when you charge your pike, if you drop that pike straight down with your arm levelled behind, yes, you can then charge your pike at the enemy. Don't worry, I'm right under it. You feel the weight of that.
Better, yeah.
Keep that under your cheek, and if you haunch back a bit and put your elbow on your hip there, you should be able to take the weight there. You feel that? Oh,
Yes,
sorry.
I can feel that,
You're straining there, aren't you? You're straining.
It's quite an awkward thing to hold.
So what you have to do now is you just lunge forward straight into the faces of the enemy there. Ah! And again, I go. Ah! I would have gone straight for the eye.
It takes a lot of strength to wield this, as well as balance and technique. So you'd expect quite well-built guys.
Absolutely. The people that used them were particularly selected from their strength and height and stature.
So the pikemen are really the brawn of the outfit.
Absolutely, yes.
All the historical evidence appears to indicate our men were soldiers from the Civil War. But will the carbon dating results confirm this?
1480 to 1687.
Hold on, 1480. So that's fine.
Yes.
These dates cover a broad period, with the Civil War lying at the latter end. But the team know they can eliminate the earlier dates because of the archaeological evidence on the ground.
The church, if you remember, was finished usage in 1580. That's why it was ruined when it looks like these men have gone in.
So we're now 1580 to 1687. And in the middle of that, right slap bang almost in the middle of that, is the siege date.
Yes.
With the siege being the only time in this period when so many men were gathered together in York, dating the burial to the English Civil War now seems certain.
What's important is that it supports what everything
exactly.
is telling us. So I think those large numbers, the regimentation of the burials, the fact that they're in the church, they're close to the city walls, everything is saying it's got to be the siege.
Yeah.
It's got to be.
Our 113 men likely never lived long enough to see victory when the Royalists gave up and left York in July 1644. And whether they were definitely parliamentarian soldiers under Lord Fairfax's command will only be confirmed when the isotope results come in. The team also still don't know what the cause of death of the men was. Although the skeletons showed no fatal wounds, many did have healed injury, and there were signs of infection. Could infections like these have killed all 113 of the men? To help understand what the cause of death might have been, Xanthi meets up with historian Rory Macready in a typical Civil War surgery. She starts by showing Rory some of the injuries from our men's bones.
Here we've got sharp force trauma to the elbow, so outside of the elbow, pretty deep actually.
Yeah.
What would have caused this?
Well, that was probably made by a sword, quite a deep cut. Probably in that sort of direction.
So some sort of defensive injury?
Yes.
It seems the surgeons did have some understanding of infection and how to manage it.
What we would do then is we would get something like oats, and I'm going to get honey. I'm going to mix the two together to make it into a paste, and then this will be put into the wound, and then we'd sew the wound up with that inside the wound.
Why did they leave that in?
Because it helps to heal. The honey would be used as an antiseptic. We didn't understand that, but we knew that it worked. In fact, today in some hospitals, when antibiotics don't work, they're using honey again to fight infections.
But as these treatments were nowhere near as effective as modern solutions, if the infection continued to spread, the surgeons had one last resort: amputation.
If I take your arm off of the elbow, you'll have about a 50-50 chance of surviving the operation. If I take it off at the shoulder, the chances are you will die.
Amputation was actually a highly sophisticated procedure surgeons were well versed in.
What we do first of all is we get a dismembering knife like this one here. The cutting edge is on the inside.
It's a pretty serious knife.
It is. My assistant would hold your arm extremely tight, act like a tourniquet. The surgeon would then plunge the knife into the limb till he hits bone, and then in a very fast motion go round in a circular motion till we come back where we started.
Like opening a can.
It is. He or she would then yank the skin and muscle up the bone to expose the bone.
Yeah.
The bone saw would then be used, and as high as possible, I would saw through the bones.
Hopefully I'm unconscious.
Might not necessarily be.
Okay.
When you've sawn through the limb,
yeah,
we then cauterise the wound. This would then go on the end of the stump.
Yeah.
What happens then, if they've done it right, the skin and muscle should be longer than the bone.
Yeah.
This should come down over the end, and now I've got squidgy bits to play with.
Yeah.
This will be pinned through the wound, and then put another pin the other way.
Why?
That way you can control the tightness. You'd put a figure of 8 loop of thread over the two ends of the pin.
Right.
I'll come along the next day, and what I'd do is I'd make that figure of 8 tighter and tighter and tighter to draw the skin and muscle over the end of the stump.
That's very clever.
Very clever.
They may not have had today's medical expertise and equipment, but Civil War surgeons were certainly competent enough to stop all our 113 men dying in one go. Simple infection can't be our cause of death. Back in Dundee, Sue is taking a closer look at the two skeletons with the extraordinary fused bones.
This individual was exceptional because this is the one where we had the most outrageous fusion that occurred at the elbow. So the hand permanently fixed in that position. And then, as if that wasn't enough, quite frankly, the absolute and utter pièce de résistance. Look at that. It's just the most outrageous specimen I think I've ever seen. So that we've got the long shaft of the femur, the thigh bone. We've got the tibia, the shin bone, at right angles. And where there should be a knee, there isn't a knee. It's fixed bone.
Sue's research has led her to believe that this could be a condition with the rarest classification possible: occurring in a maximum 1 person in every 200,000, and best illustrated by the other man's fused hand.
They call it carpal coalition syndrome because that's the most common bits that fuse together, all of these little bones. When bone forms, before it becomes bone, it's a big mass of cartilage. And if you think of it like cheddar cheese, that big lump of cheese was never cut. And so we think that this is about a malformation of the joints. This is a rare genetic condition. To find one of those is rare. To find 2 individuals that may be displaying the same thing can't be a coincidence. It absolutely can't be a coincidence.
Sue has discovered that the man with the dramatically fused knee and elbow also has fused bones in his wrist. It's significant new evidence to link the conditions of the 2 men.
He has a carpal coalition too, but it's only 2 of the bones. And the bones that it is are the bones that are sitting down at the base of the thumb. So this one that's called the trapezium and the trapezoid. These 2 little bones have fused together.
Carpal coalition syndrome is a genetic condition that's passed from parent to child.
It's inherited. If it's in your family, it stays in your family. And what's the likelihood of that occurring randomly alongside somebody else with that? You know, I don't like coincidences. I don't believe in the tooth fairy, and I don't believe in coincidence.
But Sue has to be sure. So the bones are put through a CT scanner, which looks inside the bones to give detailed images viewable from any angle. Will the results confirm or disprove Sue's diagnosis? Along with her colleague, Dr. Roos Eismer, she scours the images.
This is the whole tray laid out as it went through the scanner.
Look at this, isn't that amazing? Look at that knee
fused.
And look at that elbow. This is the knee. This, oh, look, go back, 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 go back. Look, isn't that interesting? When you've got the 2 pillars of the joint, they're continuous. All the other bits of the bone are formed. All the normal growing bits are there. What isn't there is the joint.
The space in between.
Yeah, there's no joint space. Now that isn't trauma. That isn't disease. That's embryological. Yeah. That's our multiple synostosis syndrome. That's the most amazing image.
Sue's instincts are confirmed.
The only question now is, okay, we know they've got that syndrome, we've diagnosed the syndrome, are they related?
DNA samples have been taken from the bones of the 2 men under sterile conditions. These results could confirm any familial link between the 2 soldiers, but the results are still some days away. What is already clear is that the man with the fused arm and leg would have had to live with his disability from birth. But how would he have coped with such severe disability 350 years ago? And what function could he have served in a Civil War army? Xanthi heads to Kent University to meet Julie Anderson, specialist in the history of disability. Julie has brought along a range of wooden replica crutches and supports the disabled soldier could have used.
They look pretty simple, just whatever's going to help somebody get around.
Yes, crutch design remains very simple until the 20th century. They were generally pieces of wood, carved, with some padding put on the support area under the arm.
So how mobile would the man have been? To find out, Julie's assistant Jack is given replica crutches and a knee support the man would likely have used.
Let you do it up. Now, let's see if you can not fall over, I guess.
We'll go for it.
Yeah, yeah. Now imagine if you like this all the time, you'd obviously get a bit more efficient, but he's moving all right, isn't he? We're not looking at somebody who would have just, had to sit down and not do anything, and he's still got use of this hand, even though, so literally it's here that's fused, so you could still use all the movement at the shoulder, and you've still got a viable wrist joint.
He wouldn't have fought, But Julie is sure there were plenty of other jobs he could have done.
His job would have perhaps been an ancillary worker, perhaps a cook, or maybe even, as he was a big man, guarding the ordnance, where all the munitions and the muskets and things like that were kept.
Despite a permanently fused elbow and knee, he could have functioned quite well.
You're standing at a bench,
right,
balancing now. What do you think? You managed to be a cook or a guard or something?
I'd imagine the balance might have been an issue, but you get used to it. So
yeah,
with the right arm, you can obviously do a lot of things. So
by the time
I imagine so.
Yeah, I mean, it's great to see it firsthand how this could have looked, because when you just see the remains, you think this guy would have been pretty much stuck doing nothing.
Exactly.
And Julie has rare illustrations of how people affected by disability may have lived around that time.
We've got some images here of a range of disabled people from the period.
Some of them have got musical instruments and things.
Well, they would have been working people. You have to remember that there was no institutionalization really before the 19th century. So people had to just go out and make their own living, which a lot of people did as best they could.
Because some of these are in pairs, like this person looks blind and they're being led by somebody else.
Yes, that was common too. They would get together in bands,
yeah,
and look after each other. It's the same for our man in the military. He would have been part of a group and they would have looked after him.
They wouldn't have seen him as unusual?
No, not at all. In fact, the word normal doesn't really come into common usage in the English language until the early part of the 19th century.
Was there just no purpose for it?
No, it wasn't necessary. People were just who they were.
But despite this apparent tolerance, relatives often suffered. Extreme religious beliefs saw disability as a sign that the person's family had committed a sin.
They would be ostracized, they would be shunned by their communities, and it was difficult. Some families had to move away, but often when the disabled person grew up, they would leave home.
And the military could prove useful in these circumstances.
Would disabled people actually have gone into the military to relieve their families of that burden?
Absolutely, and because unemployment was a problem amongst disabled people, often the military provided a haven for them in order for them to be paid at a job.
So it's not a surprise to have found the disabled in the army, even holding down a key job. Nor is it a surprise to find two disabled men grouped together for support. Back in Dundee, Caroline and her colleague Chris Rinn are close to reconstructing what our two men may have looked like. The older man is missing his front tooth from the blow to the face he took, likely in battle. But the more severely disabled man's face has been more complicated.
It's been a really challenging process for me with this one. This was very definitely asymmetry that was extreme. It's just been really interesting to try and show the face of someone with a congenital condition. And we're seeing some dysmorphia, some changes to the facial structure that may be connected to this condition. What I've done is to take in a nose from a database and then try and distort that to fit with the bones. You can see that we've got quite a bent shape to the lateral nasal bones, the bones on the side of the nose, which is suggesting this shape here. And one of the things that I've noted a lot in the literature for this condition, we may have to consider giving him cross eyes, because that seems to be a likely option.
But were these two men really related, as their shared rare condition suggests? To find out, the team gather to hear the results of the DNA analysis, with Sue especially on tenterhooks.
A bit frustratingly, they came back as having...
Something like that now. You've already gone too far.
They don't have the same mother.
But we've got DNA out of it.
Yes. DNA was viable. It does not appear to be contaminated.
Okay. But...
Apparently, though, looking for the male lineage on the Y chromosome is much... You've got to go right down to the nuclear level, and the DNA is not viable at that level. Don't look at me like that.
Well, that's just rubbish, quite frankly.
So we can't
that's
say...
unacceptable.
We can't say that they're not brothers, fraternal brothers, but we can say that we can't tell, and they're not maternally related.
Frustratingly for Sue, the DNA shows the two men aren't related by mother, and it isn't good enough quality to prove whether they were related by father or not. But Sue's not going to give up on her theory easily.
So it is possible that they could still be related,
yeah,
but we just can't show it. I think, you know, the chances of having this condition in individuals who are not related and are in the same, pretty much almost the same grave at the same time, would be stretching it a bit far.
They could still be cousins or half-brothers, but where were they from? The isotope results are also in. Will these help to determine whether the men were part of Lord Fairfax's parliamentary army?
The two do have the same isotopic signature.
Good.
And I've got some interesting data for the diet, which is quite specifically interesting to these guys. They had a 20 to 25% fish intake in their diet, which is really high. Normally we'd be looking at 0 to 5%. In York, you can have, unless it's fresh water, but these have got a really high fish, both of the brothers.
So it has to be coastal.
This is a fascinating discovery for the team. The isotopes say both our men had high marine diets. But how does this fit with the theory that they were part of Fairfax's army in York? Civil War expert Andrew Hopper thinks he has the answer and has invited Xanthi to the Yorkshire port of Hull to explain.
Hull was the most important northern port town held by Parliament during the Civil Wars. Okay. Prior to the Siege of York, it was also the base of the parliamentarian commander in Yorkshire, Lord Fairfax. Quite a large proportion of Lord Fairfax's parliamentarian army from Yorkshire came from Hull and in the parishes around it. There was a large merchant fleet based here, and many of the seamen volunteered to fight for Parliament.
So you're saying then that these guys I've been looking at that I presumed are soldiers would actually have originally been sailors?
It's very likely that they had been, yes.
But why would sailors be useful to Lord Fairfax in the Siege of York?
Hull's sailors would all have been experienced cannoneers, experienced artillerymen. They would have served on merchant vessels that had been armed, and they'd also been probably quite hardy folk, having sailed across the North Sea. So they would have been prized commodities in a siege situation.
So our men's experience with cannon on board ship could have made them highly useful in a siege war.
Lord Fairfax invested the city from the southeast between the rivers Foss and Ouse and set up his gun batteries on Lamel Hill. And from there they would pour down fire and the royalist defences were.
Well, that's really interesting because the mass graves, and specifically these two brothers in arms, they were buried very near there. So they were probably actually part of this actual military operation, weren't they?
Yes, I should think it's very likely.
Do we have any documentary evidence available from the time?
Well, the garrison accounts of Hull in 1642 and 1643 survive.
Oh, wow.
And they're very detailed, and they give us the names of 3 of the gunners.
Really?
3 of the cannoneers in Hull.
Oh, is this actually from the original document, a copy of it?
Yes, we have here Thomas Coatsforth and the cannoneers at the blockhouse, James Hunter and the cannoneers in the town, and another gentleman here, Cowling the gunner, mentioned in the accounts.
It's a bit of a reach, but theoretically one of these men could be one of the men I've been looking at.
Well, if they weren't one of the men you were looking at, it's very likely they would have been very well known or personally known to them.
That's pretty close, isn't it?
But why would a group of sailors give up their livelihoods and sign up to fight in Fairfax's land army? Was there a greater motivation behind their actions? Xanthi meets Civil War specialist Diane Purkis at Holy Trinity in York, a simple church she believes the parliamentarian soldiers would have approved of.
They felt this was what God wanted, absolute plainness and spareness. Anything else was an insult to him. This plainness permeated people's whole lives. You'd live the right way, you'd be chaste, you'd be abstinent, you'd read the Bible every day.
Many ordinary Englishmen joined the parliamentarian cause because they hated the elaborate ritualistic church King Charles I stood for, as well as his belief he was appointed by God to rule by divine right.
He tried to impose on the Church of England a much more posh, hierarchical, glittering, bishop-driven kind of model of what the Church of England ought to be, and these people didn't want a bar of it. But they also thought that was actually icon worship, something that pretended to represent God, but actually broke the second commandment, where God says, "Thou shalt not make unto thyself a graven image."
How do we go from religious fervour to war?
Well, some of these guys actually thought that they were fighting in the last battle between Christ and the forces of Antichrist. Some of the more radical ones believed that if they acted rightly, it would actually inspire Christ to come down from heaven and rule the world.
And save the world.
And save the world, and create an ideal world.
Well, that's worth dying for then. It's a massive cause.
Yeah, exactly.
And Diane has written evidence of the soldiers' religious fervour.
This is actually a letter that was sent to London. This man plainly thought he was God's soldier. It's actually headed, "A relation of the great victory obtained by God's assistance by the Parliament's forces." And the letter itself says, "Sir, by God's blessing, I can tell you I am alive, and so are you. And by God's victorious arm, the Church of God is alive."
So each and every man thought he was God's soldier?
Yeah, and they thought the army was the Church of God. So now the opposing royalists in the field are God's enemies.
They're radicalised. That's how we see it today.
That's right, yeah. So the experience of serving in this army and thinking these kinds of religious thoughts has radicalised this man.
Was it this same religious conviction that drove our men to the Siege of York and their eventual demise? The team believe they now know where the men were from. They know who they were fighting for and what their motivation was. But they still don't know how they died.
There is evidence of having fracture occur to bone, but it's very well healed. There's an evidence of infection to bone, but again, it's very well healed. All of this is consistent with them being a fighting force, but it's not consistent with what caused their death. And if you can rule out the infection side and the trauma side, the only thing that's really left as a feasible cause of death is going to be disease. It has to be disease as the most likely cause of death for so many individuals.
How would doctors have dealt with disease back in the 17th century? Xanthi goes to the Museum of the History of Science in Oxford to meet medical historian Dr. Erica Charters.
Got an intriguing little box here. Do we need the gloves?
So we need the gloves on to touch some of this.
Erica has a remarkable device used to treat disease and fever until the late 19th century, and similar to those doctors would have used during the English Civil War.
This is actually to let blood.
Right.
Now, this is where the exciting bit happens. This would go right up against your skin.
Yeah.
Oh. Before you know it, it would cut into your skin. It would make very small incisions, and this would allow you to let some blood out. And of course, bloodletting was, well, it's been very popular for a long time, so definitely in the 17th century they would have been doing this. So you just press the button there and hold it.
Oh, it's quite powerful, isn't it?
It is quite powerful, and you can see where it's cut into the paper.
Yeah. So was there an idea that there were poisons in the blood that you actually wanted to release by bloodletting?
Very much so. And what we do see, especially for fevers, remembering if you think of how someone looks who has a fever, they're flushed, they're very warm, their pulse is beating very quickly, so it almost looks like they have an excess of blood. So it's not surprising that some people felt that letting out some of that excess of blood would return you to health.
Does it actually have any benefits?
Not that we know of, no.
With little more than bloodletting as a treatment, and with thousands of men camped closely together during the siege, Erica believes she knows what could have killed the 113 men.
Something like typhus fever, the incubation is probably around 3 weeks, and very commonly what we see in diaries of sieges is that after about 3 weeks during a siege, we see outbreaks of disease.
How does it spread?
Well, it's very contagious. Typhus is interesting because it's spread through body lice, and they actually live in the seams of your clothing. So it's a particular kind of insect which is a vector for the pathogen. And what's interesting about it is the lice only like living at the temperature of your body. So they will only stay in your clothes when you're wearing your clothes, which is why we often see it in sieges. It's very common in wintertime when people keep their clothes on. So it could possibly have been there even during the summer in York.
And what are the symptoms?
Well, it's a general fever, a kind of weakening, very often a very intense headache. Sometimes you see a rash.
How many people died of typhus?
Well, it depends. We know that when we look at case fatality rates, so if you catch it, what the chances are that you will die. We've seen during the First World War, it reached rates such as 70%. And because it's so contagious, if you're in a small area together, there's a good chance that almost everyone will catch it.
Because it was so contagious, did they die from this more so than from fighting?
It would be much more likely that you might die of disease. And of course, it's not a very glorious death.
No.
It's one thing to die on the battlefield. It's another thing to die of something like diarrhea or a fever. It's not exactly the way that you want to go.
The team finally has a plausible, if tragic, explanation for how the men in the mass graves died. A virulent outbreak of typhus fever, a disease that has afflicted besieging armies from ancient times right up to Stalingrad in the Second World War. With the final part of the puzzle in place, it's time for the story the bones have told to be relayed back to the local community. The cold case team has returned to York. There to hear their findings are those who originally excavated the site and experts who have assisted the team.
I'm hoping to find out more of why they died, more about why they were buried in that particular spot, and who buried them and at what period of the Civil Wars they were buried in. All those questions that purely the historical evidence isn't able to answer.
The facial reconstructions is something I haven't been involved with before, and hopefully that'll give us an insight, a closer insight into the people who we're dealing with.
Ghoulishly exciting.
Sue reveals the bigger story of the Civil War.
It's reasonable to suspect that they're going to be fighting men.
She unpacks how the men would have died.
What do we find in terms of a cause of death? Well, we don't find trauma. What we've been told is that, in fact, more people died as a result of disease.
The more intimate story of disability.
His right leg would have been fixed that way. A condition that is so rare, we don't have an incidence for the rarity of it.
And how the science tied two remarkable men's lives together in death.
So now what we've got are two individuals buried in the same location with the rarest of genetic conditions, not with the same mother. Hopefully their father had a bike, but not with the same mother, with exactly the same stable isotopes in terms of where they've come from, and with exactly the same unusual marine-based diet of a very high proportion. They have got to go together.
The final part of the investigation is to bring these two soldiers back to life, beginning with the man with just a fused hand.
It's a strong face. It's a very strong face. Yeah. It's actually quite a pleasant face.
He would fit in amongst us, wouldn't he?
Then there is the more severely affected man.
Now, I don't know whether his squint eye was inward pointing or outward pointing. When we looked at the literature, inward pointing seemed to be more common.
These guys would have been used to seeing people who'd had much more major battlefield wounds. Sure. And, you know, like your face cut in half by a cavalry sabre, you're losing an eye to a pike. that asymmetry is relatively slight in comparison with what they would have seen.
And for Sue, it's this man's story that has been the greatest revelation.
He was active. So he's not a passive person. He's been with the rest of them, treated the same way as the rest of them. Whether we now might think of him differently in terms of a disability, that disability wasn't being recognized as him being an outcast. He was treated very, very much like the others. It is an absolutely unique set of remains. It is fascinating.
They give us that opportunity to bring the science in, use the historical background, and it really fleshes out those people that we're dealing with during that quite tumultuous period of English history.
So science gave you everything I was hoping for. It gave you that element that the historical document can't deal with. It gave us something beyond the paper, beyond the page, and beyond the text.
The guy with the disabilities, I was just fascinated that such a guy could find a place in Fairfax's army. I think that tells us something so important about the way this war was developing and the way people were thinking. Because plainly, we've got an evolving meritocracy here. Every man was supposed to be good for their job, and if they were good for their job, that was good enough. And that was what led, really, to the modern parliamentary democracy that we all enjoy.
The Cold Case team has uncovered two remarkable tales. The larger story of the 113. Strong, committed men fighting for a cause, tragically cut down by disease before their victory was assured. But also the personal story of two men, likely closely related, who despite huge disadvantages stayed together in life and death, forever brothers in arms. The story complete, their remarkable bones are now handed back to the community.
This has been such an amazing story because it brings so many different elements together. It is a huge historical story, but it's also an incredibly important story. I'm not aware in the literature of anywhere of this type of remains ever having been recorded before. I think this is a first. I may be wrong, but I think it is a first.
At Dundee Centre for Anatomy and Human Identification, the History Cold Case team is about to take on a dramatic new case surrounding a major unsolved archaeological mystery.
Our next case, wonderful name, it's called Windy Pits. You've got human remains that are spanning across 3,000 years.
Setting up a mobile forensic lab, they will investigate the puzzling remains of more than 20 people discovered here in underground caves. They're believed to be some of the oldest human bones ever found in Britain.
Location even better. The remote North Yorkshire moors.
Oh, my neck of the woods.
In winter.
Excellent.
Potholing.
Who are they? And why are their bones here?
Perhaps it would have taken 4 or 5 people to hold him down.
Are the caves simply Iron Age graveyards? Or is there a more sinister explanation for how this became the final resting place of so many people?
If these bones came up as a forensic case, I would be advising the police we need to look at this a lot more closely.
The investigation will shine a light on a long-forgotten period of our ancient history.
Oh, okay.
A time of brutal rituals and bizarre beliefs, when people lived in fear of what lay beneath the surface of the earth.
The coup de grace. There'll be a great spurt of blood.
Can modern forensics finally solve the mystery of what happened at the Windy Pits? And what dark and surprising new truths will emerge about how we lived 2,000 years ago? The skeletons at the centre of this investigation were excavated from an extraordinary network of limestone caves, carved deep into the landscape of the North York Moors. There are believed to be 22 people among the remains, but information about who they were and how they died has remained tantalisingly beyond our reach. With so many questions still unanswered, local archaeologists carefully lay out the bones again in a mobile forensic unit close to where they were first excavated. They hope a brand new investigation using science as well as historical analysis will help explain what happened here.
Well, this is interesting.
Forensic anthropologist Dr. Xanthi Mallet arrives to make the first visual assessment of the bones before reporting back to team leader Professor Sue Black in Dundee.
There's a huge amount of work to do here. There's going to be 22 individuals, we believe, maybe more, maybe less. But you've got to ask what they're doing out on the middle of North Yorkshire moors. And when you've got 3,000 years worth of history involved, I can't for a moment imagine what that's going to turn into.
Archaeologist Graham Lee brings Xanthi up to speed with how this unique and unusual hoard of human remains was discovered.
I've been looking forward to you coming in, actually, because this is a real puzzle we've got going on here. What do you know about them?
Well, all of the bones here have come from things called windy pits, which are natural fissures where the rock has cracked apart and created some quite deep kind of caverns in the edge of the valleys. And when people started exploring the windy pits, they started finding these fragments of human bone.
The remains are thought to span several thousand years, from Roman times right back to around 2000 BC. The team wants to focus their inquiry on a group of 4 individuals that were found together in one of the deepest caves, known as Slip Gill.
All of these come from just one of the windy pits, Slip Gill, which is one of the deepest and steepest of the fissures. These have been radiocarbon dated to about the middle of the 1st century BC to the beginning of the 2nd century AD. They were found in a heap at the bottom of the windy pit, and it's virtually a sort of 23-25 metre drop, pretty much straight down from the entrance. So they've all ended up being kind of squashed together at the bottom, together with kind of rocks and other debris. The suggestion has been made that it could be a family.
But why might a family end up dead in a cave? At the site where they were found, Xanthi sees for herself why these mysterious caves are called the Windy Pits.
We're now above Slip Gill, which is one of the deepest windy pits. And can you see all the vegetation's moving here? Mm-hmm. And that's a result of the hot draft coming up from the mouth of the windy pit.
I can see why this would have been a really kind of mysterious place.
It looks spooky, doesn't it?
It does, yes. Oh, you can feel the warm air from here really
Straight
well,
away.
can't you? Yeah.
The human bones found in Slip Gill date from around the 1st century AD.
There was a series of expeditions into these fissures, say, through the 1950s. I'm not sure that you would actually look at them and say that everyone is necessarily clad that appropriately for caving.
Some hard hats.
Yep.
And some ropes, that's pretty much it, and a spade.
And they were the people that recovered the bits and pieces of the bodies from the bottom.
Since being found in the 1950s, the bones have been the subject of much study and debate. But the job of this new investigation is to look at the evidence again with fresh eyes and without being influenced by any previous theories. Back in the mobile laboratory, Xanthi begins the task of making sense of the puzzling remains. She will look for signs that could confirm age, gender, and any evidence of trauma. But the incompleteness of the skeletons will prove a major hurdle in trying to establish the identities of the dead.
Not very much here with this one. No skull, no pelvis. Not very much at all. Initially, we're looking certainly an adult individual. Pretty robust femur, been reconstructed slightly, so first gut feeling would be that this is probably a male. Luckily, we've got quite a bit of the skull on this one, so this might actually work for reconstruction.
As her initial examination continues, she spots a curious injury on the jawbone of one of the males.
Now, that might be our first sign of significant trauma. This is it looks like a sharp force trauma to the side of the mandible, which would just be along your jawline. This is not an injury that's happened a reasonable time before death and the bone has started to regenerate. So, initial impression would be that this is an injury that could have occurred around the time of death.
So at least one of the 4 people from Slipgill may not have died of natural causes.
So we've got some interesting elements mixed in. We've got some sharp force trauma on a fairly robust group. It's interesting.
By forensically retracing events around the scene of death and gaining clues as to who these people were in life, can they uncover what happened here? This case promises to drag the team back to a largely unrecorded period of our history. It's a rare opportunity to build a personalised account of life and death in Britain 2,000 years ago. Back at headquarters in Dundee, they must first agree on the direction the investigation will take. Xanthi brings Professor Sue Black up to speed, along with Professor Caroline Wilkinson, who is in charge of facial reconstruction.
One of the cave sites is literally just kind of like a hole in this bowl in the earth, and it's basically goes straight down. It's like a chimney. And so people have obviously been deposited in here, and we're not sure why.
To help understand the shape and size of the Slipgill cave where the 4 skeletons were found, Xanthi shows them a 3D reconstruction.
The CGI will really help you get a kind of visual on the type of system we're talking about. Can you see that? Can you see that? So this is kind of open, desolate moorland. This is going down into the cave, so you can see the shaft.
That's great.
It's huge, isn't it? It's amazing. Yeah. So you can see how bodies would have tumbled down here. Once they get kind of down the channel and over that ridge, this is where they would have landed.
Presumed to be the bones of a man, a woman, and 2 teenagers, the obvious question is why?
You've got to wonder why, why they're putting people in here. Is this ritualistic? Is this just vindictive? Are people just being, murdered and in essence hidden?
Concealing them.
Exactly, yeah.
To try and get some concrete answers about who these people were, bone samples taken in the field will go forward for forensic testing.
DNA is the obvious one. Obviously, are we looking for a biological relationship which ties all or any of the 4 individuals? Yeah.
Carbon dating has already been carried out on the bones, placing them around the turn of the 1st century AD.
So that really only leaves us with stable isotopes.
Indeed. Yeah, so obviously with that, we're going to be wondering, are they local? Were they always local?
But it will tell us a bit about diet as well.
Exactly, okay. Yeah. And possibly quality of life, standard, that kind of thing as well.
Okay.
So we're going to be doing the stable isotopes.
So besides all of the tests that we can do, I think we really need to look at the context, the wider context. Who was potentially using this as a burial site, deposition site, or was this accidental? Why? The bigger picture. It's a real kind of intriguing puzzle, isn't it?
Yes, it's not normal.
No.
No, it isn't normal.
No, nothing normal about
and
this.
so there is a story. It's about finding out what the most likely story is.
The damaged jawbone belonging to the teenage male is the only hard evidence they have so far that this might not be a straightforward or innocent burial. But it's enough to rouse Sue's suspicions.
The likely scenario, sounding as if what we've got is a suspicious situation. where 4 individuals are found at the bottom of a very long shaft in the middle of remote moors, but there are other caves around it where obviously something untoward must have gone on at different times in history.
One of the first tests is DNA. This could establish if the skeletons have more than their final resting place in common.
Are they a family? So do we have mum, dad, and 2 adolescent children? The only way we're going to be able to find that out is if we can extract DNA, and we can match them through DNA.
But the older the bones, the harder it is to get meaningful results. And science alone won't be enough to solve this case. The carbon dating places our skeletons in the early part of the Roman occupation. But if our people were locals, theirs would likely be a very pre-Roman way of life, much as people had existed in and around the moors for millennia. Xanthi has come to a traditional Iron Age village to meet archaeologist Steve Sherlock. She wants to understand how our people from Slipgill might have lived, and why their remains would be in a cave.
So the individuals from Windy Pits, would they have been living somewhere like this?
They'd have been living in this sort of environment, in these sort of structures, indeed.
How many people would have lived in a house like this?
One family, but would have probably been 8 to 10 people living in a house like this.
And how many houses like this would have made up a community?
There could have been 4 or 5 houses of this size in a busy village.
That's quite a large community then.
Indeed it is, and we mustn't just think of this one community. There would be another one really quite close by.
And they would have interacted with each other?
They would have traded, farmed and communicated with each other, supported and helped each other. We're talking about society here, not individual groups.
During the Iron Age, the British population topped 3 million people. This was a sophisticated culture and society. Steve explains how the part of the moors where the Windy Pits are located were a sort of no man's land between 2 competing Celtic tribes.
The Windy Pits are an interesting area because they're on the North Yorkshire moors, which are, let's say, a neutral area between a tribe to the south called the Parisi and the tribes to the north of the Brigantes. So it's probable that the Parisi were using the Windy Pits. They're the people that are having sites and activities on the southern part of the North Yorkshire moors.
Would the 2 different tribes have fought?
There may well have been territorial differences, but there's no evidence for battles as such.
Curiously, Steve is convinced that caves would not normally have been used for burials, or deposition as archaeologists call it.
The normal burial rite may well have been cremation, scattering the ashes to the wind, or people being buried at locations nearer to the settlements, a long way away from the Windy Pits.
So it's a really different type of deposition?
It's a different deposition in terms of the choosing a location and potentially only choosing certain people, of course, to be buried at those points.
So if people aren't living in the immediate vicinity, it's taken a lot of people a lot of effort to bury people there.
Indeed, that's telling us there's a religious action to this and choosing people, location for a special reason.
This points to the discovery of the skeletons at Slipgill being something unusual and special, even for Iron Age society. How did the bodies end up several feet down in the dark, and why? Might the bones finally give up some answers? Back at Dundee HQ, the team is desperate for a new lead. They assemble to receive the results of the DNA analysis. Dr. Ian Barnes, from Royal Holloway, University of London, has the difficult task of trying to answer the question of whether the 2,000-year-old bones at Slipgill come from people who are genetically related.
We're hanging on your every word in the hope that you're going to give us something phenomenally exciting. And over to you.
Yeah.
That face says everything. Go
okay,
on.
so basically we've had a couple of goes at getting DNA from this material, and there's just nothing that is reliable, and it looks to us like there's multiple sequences laid over the top of each other. So we think it's just contamination.
Okay.
I don't think there's any real DNA from those individuals in the samples that you gave us.
It's disappointing news. Ian thinks that the bones may have become contaminated, making it impossible to answer whether the male, female and teenagers are related.
So it doesn't really help the story in any way, because potentially, A, they could still be family and linked genetically. We just can't tell.
Yeah.
Well, that's disappointing, but so be it. That's the way science goes.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for that, Ian.
Right, sorry about that.
No
Good
problem.
to speak to you. Thanks
Thank
again.
you.
Take care. Bye.
With DNA having failed to provide any leads, Sue feels it's time she examined the bones herself. To scour them for possible causes of death, she starts by looking at the injury to the jawbone of the teenage male. Her experience alerts her to how serious a blow this could have been.
It's one of the most dangerous places for men who are shaving, just right there. Because if you put your finger just lightly on there, you'll feel an artery pulsing underneath, and the facial artery comes up just on there. Just perfectly where that is, may I say. So that what you have is a real nick into the bone. That's not a thin-bladed implement. We've got a large blade. So whether you're talking axe, you're talking machete, you're talking something that is a large blade. It's not like a little thin kitchen knife, because you have a wide entrance and a narrow point at which it's come to a stop before it's been pulled out. And so that when that implement has come up onto that jawline, what it's then done is it's caused fracturing to run across here and up there, and then up towards the base of this tooth.
Sue believes this wasn't self-inflicted. He may have been murdered.
It certainly will have caused a lot of pain and a lot of bleeding. It could have resulted in death. This has been caused by somebody else. Somebody has inflicted this on this individual. And it's a young individual.
And then, on the leg bones of the adult male, she spots more suspicious marks.
This is a pattern that's quite consistent with a fracture occurring what's called a green bone. So it behaves very differently from an old bone that doesn't have much water content and organic material still left in it. What we don't have is any evidence of healing. So this is consistent with the person perhaps dead, perhaps not quite dead, being dropped down onto a height.
There's no proof yet, but Sue feels that taking all the evidence so far, a picture of suspicious death is definitely emerging for this group.
If these bones came up as a forensic case, I would be advising the police we need to look at this a lot more closely. There's something very suspicious going on here. You might cut yourself shaving, but you sure as heck don't cut yourself shaving at that depth. So that the sharp trauma injury, if nothing else, is decidedly suspicious.
Xanthi has an agonizing wait to return to Slip Gill. She's keen to test the theory that the breaks on the leg bones of the adult male could have been caused by falling into the cave. But the caves are important roosting sites for bats, and access is restricted. Finally, spring arrives, and she's able to meet up again with archaeologist Graham Lee and local caver Martin Rowe.
Lovely to meet you. Is it quite dangerous in there, do you think? Have you got any idea?
For anybody who didn't have the right equipment and knew how to use it, then potentially it is, because just behind me here is a 16-metre drop straight to the floor.
That is deep, isn't it? Straight down?
Straight down, yeah.
Even an experienced caver like Martin thinks twice about entering Slip Gill. He'll carefully descend to show Xanthi the inside of the cave via a camera attached to his helmet. For the first time, she will see the real anatomy of the final resting place of the skeletons. The first few metres of Slip Gill are on a shallow incline before Martin reaches the main shaft.
Just to let you know what I'm doing, I'm moving towards the top of the big drop.
And you should be seeing a big dark hole in front of me.
There he goes. Oh, look at that. That's like going into the abyss, isn't it?
Yep. Yep, you can see there's nothing under him there.
The cave is 16 metres deep, certainly a potentially fatal drop. A series of overhanging rocks make the final descent particularly perilous.
That must be pretty scary in there, mustn't it? Because it's going to be pitch black, except for that little light coming off your head torch.
Yep.
Oh, dear. That wasn't very clever.
So he's going to be now touching down where the bodies were found on that
Yes.
kind of scree slope.
Exactly.
So I'm at the bottom now.
What I'll do now is I'll turn on the big light.
And show you how far I've come down from the surface.
Okay, great,
Oh, wow.
Wow, look at that.
It's an extraordinary place, and one that's remained unchanged for thousands of years.
So
That
you
is a
can
long
see
way.
the nature of the fissure.
It's very slim on the way down,
Yeah,
isn't
it is. It is a very narrow
Look.
slot. That's fantastic.
And this ties in with the idea that our man fell from a height.
So once a body went in there, it's basically going to slide down that chimney, bounce off some rocks on the way down, off the ledge, and land at the bottom, down on this scree slope down here.
That's it.
Wow.
Yeah.
I just can't imagine anyone getting out of that alive.
Xanthi's happy that the man's injuries are consistent with the cave being the scene of death. But why were these people here? What was the significance of this place?
Oh, I think we're going to see him in a second. Hey, there he is. Hello. How you doing?
I'm a bit sweaty.
Well done, sir.
Yay.
In one piece.
Quite relieved to have you back with us.
Yeah, very much so. Well done.
Hey.
Meanwhile, in Dundee, Caroline is beginning the facial reconstruction. None of the 4 skeletons in the group has a complete skull, but Caroline is hoping there are enough pieces to rebuild the face of the adult male.
Well, we've got quite a lot of pieces, and it looks like when you hold them next to each other that they do fit. That piece clearly fits against there. And we've got large sections that have already been reassembled that need a little bit of adjustment, but again, we've got other large pieces that fit. But this isn't really a problem for us because we can scan them with the scanner, and then you can see the join lines on the scan, and we can just adjust the piece in the computer. So it makes it a whole lot easier than having to get rid of this glue and re-glue it.
But one crucial part of his skull is missing.
Now notice we've got no nasal bones, which just at the top of the nose here, which are quite important in predicting the nose, but that seems like the only bit of the nose that's missing, so we can do some estimation from that.
Now that Caroline has examined the 2,000-year-old skull, she will use some very 21st century technology to rebuild it. Xanthi's research has indicated caves were not usually used in Iron Age burial practices. So she needs to continue on the trail of investigating why a cave like Slip Gill would have been significant. She travels to the Dales to meet Tom Lord from Lancaster University.
And we've got a rather atmospheric day to visit a cave.
Tom believes that for our ancestors, caves had special significance.
Oh, look at this. It's certainly very dark and imposing.
We're going underground, we're going literally into another world, an underworld.
And is that how our ancestors actually would have seen this place?
I think so.
Lights on?
Lights on.
Okay.
Helmet. And we're going into the underworld.
Okay.
Right.
Yes, please.
It gets darker, echoey.
It gets darker immediately, doesn't it?
Lose direct light.
Okay.
The cave is wet, it's dripping.
Tom has found evidence pointing to how caves were used in the Iron Age, including human bones and artifacts. He thinks the way in which precious objects like these were placed suggests that caves were spiritually very important.
And that's a perforated piece of red deer.
I was going to say, because this isn't a bone that I recognise.
It's red deer anthill. If you hold it up, can you see the very careful hole that's drilled through it? You can see it's been drilled through. It's probably been on a shaft.
Is this a weapon of some sort?
It might be used as a hammer or something. And this was on a ledge about 45 feet down, so it could only have been put there, it couldn't have fallen there.
But this would have been a valuable object. Somebody's gone to a lot of time to make this into a hammer or whatever else. You're not going to leave that down a cave without good reason.
Tom believes valuable objects were placed in caves, perhaps as votive offerings or as part of rituals.
We might be seeing down some of these deep shafts, beginning about 5,000 years ago, is actual sacrifice of human and animals at certain times.
So these could be offering to the gods?
Offering to the gods of the
underworld.
This idea of an underworld crops up throughout history and across cultures. And caves were seen as portals to a mysterious place between the surface world and another. Tom's evidence also suggests a new explanation for how the slipgill individuals may have died. He believes they may have been part of some kind of ritual sacrifice.
The archaeologists tell us that there's a distinct possibility that there's a ritualistic element to the way in which these individuals have landed up in these caves. We unquestionably have got evidence of interpersonal violence before these individuals have met their death. There is some evidence that when they've gone down the pit that there is long bone fracturing because of the drop. But there's no evidence that those have healed. If they've been alive at the bottom of the pit, it's not for very long. But, you know, that's really just looking at the evidence from the bones. I think it's most likely that they were killed before they went down the pit.
To test this new theory that the people of Slipgill were consciously sacrificed, the bones are sent to the nearby Nine Wells Hospital for CT scanning. This should reveal new information not visible to the naked eye. The evidence already points to the adult male having fractured his leg. But Sue and her colleague, Dr. Roos Eismer, now spot some new evidence, this time on the thigh bone belonging to the adult female.
Look. On that femur, that's a beautiful butterfly-type fracture. That's the kind of fracture that is green bone, so it's bone that's gone down, that's still got all its pliability and its plasticity, and it's fractured. It produces just such a different pattern. So, like the other femur, I think that's a perimortem, around about the time of death type fracture. Isn't that interesting?
They found exactly the same type of break in the male and female adult thigh bones, caused around the time of death. Sue doesn't think it's just a coincidence. She thinks it could point to a deliberate attempt to immobilize the two adults.
You know, we've got two femora now that have got perimortem trauma. Why just in one bone? Why is it just the leg that's broken?
In more or less the same place.
In more or less the same place, yeah. It just makes you wonder if that's part of the incapacitation of the individual. I don't know. You don't tend to run very fast if you've got a broken leg.
This new evidence begs the question, what method could have been used to do this? Were there weapons available back then which could fit this pattern of trauma? And then there is also the injury on the jaw of the teenage boy. Could this tie in with those seen on the adults?
It can be the same implement that causes both sharp force and blunt force trauma. Just depends which bit you hit it with. So the back of an axe causes blunt force trauma, but the front of an axe causes sharp force trauma. And we have what we think is some evidence of sharp force trauma up on the mandible. So it could be the same implement that can cause it, but just used in a different way.
The breaks to the femurs on both the adults support the idea that the skeletons died at the same time, and possibly by the same method. It's a breakthrough for the team. This and the potentially fatal blow to the head on the teenage boy now leads to new questions. If we are now looking at human sacrifice, how and why did they die? Xanthi takes these latest findings to Professor Miranda Aldous-Green from Cardiff University, an expert in Iron Age rituals. She agrees that the skeletons show signs of having been ritually sacrificed.
Given the fact that you seem to have repeated injuries, and given where they've been put, you know, in a cave system, that rings warning bells for me in terms of possible sacrificial activity. And the fact that it's going on over a long time suggests that, you know, this place is special, and particular people who've met deaths in a ritualistic way may have been placed there quite deliberately.
Miranda believes that some uniquely preserved bodies, found not in caves but in marshland, could offer an explanation for exactly how and why the slipgill individuals met their death.
We have a particular group of individuals that are called bog bodies, which are found in swamps or marshes all over northwest Europe. And a lot of them, interestingly, are quite young and show signs of traumatic injury, sometimes over time, but then would lead to their death.
What types of injuries are you seeing?
Well, persistently hanging, garrotting, you know, various forms of suffocation. You do get bloodletting. There are some people who've been disemboweled, throats cut and so on, but there is this very strong evidence from the European Iron Age and into the Roman period of people who, ever so often, were chosen for some reason to be sacrificed in a particularly spectacular way and thrust deep into a marsh.
So you're looking at marsh bodies, but the individuals I'm looking at are from a cave. Would that be considered ritualistic?
Well, I think so. I think the whole thing with bogs and caves is that they're so-called liminal places. Yeah. They're edgy places. They're on the boundaries between the material world and the world of the dead, the underworld.
Bog bodies, discovered the world over, provide historians with ample evidence about human sacrifice. Much of the soft tissue remains, revealing crucial forensic details. One of the most famous is Lindau Man, who is thought to date from the same period as the Windy Pit skeletons.
Very lovely. Oh, now that's Lindau Man, isn't it?
That's Lindau Man, yes, indeed, from Cheshire.
Yeah.
Found in August 1984 when peat cutting was going on. And he was found in the peat. And he had been bludgeoned hard on the head twice.
Wow.
And then he had been garroted and his throat cut. And he had various other traumas as well. He'd been kneed in the back as though somebody had forced him to kneel down. So he had all sorts of other injuries.
He's beautifully preserved, isn't
Yes, he is. And
wow.
he was probably of quite high status. We can tell that because his moustache was very carefully trimmed using shears, which are an expensive piece of kit. And his fingernails showed that he'd never done any manual work.
Ah, I see.
And he was about 20, 25 years old, so he would have been in prime condition. Who knows who he was? He could have been a hostage. He could have been some kind of criminal, but more likely he was chosen to be a sacrifice, I suspect, at a time of great crisis.
Having studied the evidence in detail, Miranda has come up with a scenario of what happened during an Iron Age human sacrifice, and it all centres on the idea of overkill.
If you're going to sacrifice me, what are you going to do?
Well, I might drug you. I might give you some herbs or some psychotropic substance, perhaps to make you a little bit more acquiescent, because you might struggle otherwise.
Compliant.
And then I will then turn you round away from me.
Right.
Give you 2 hard blows on the skull, and that will crack the skull, by which time you are stunned, perhaps barely conscious, hovering on the edge of consciousness and beginning to sort of weave around. And don't forget, this is theatre.
Yeah.
You have lots of people watching.
We're putting on a show.
So it's really important. So the next thing I'm going to do is to garrote you.
Oh, okay.
I'm going to twist that. Okay. I'm going to leave that in place, so you are now on the verge of death, but not quite dead. Okay, hold that thought. And then the coup de grace. I will slit your throat, and because of the garrote, there'll be a great spurt of blood and a great cheer from all the community, and the sacrifice will be complete.
Yeah, now I'm dead, for sure.
Indeed.
Why so many ways of doing it, though? I mean, you've drugged me, you've strangled me, now you're slitting my throat.
It's partly because the overkill violence is necessary for the sacrifice to be really effective. Look at the investment of time and trouble and effort there has been in sacrificing you. But also, I've got to represent the entire community who are sacrificing you, perhaps to cleanse the community of all their sins and wickednesses and ills and pollution.
So if you don't have a marshy environment, you've only got the caves. What would happen then?
The death would happen, the killing would happen outside the caves, and you would then be deposited. And there must be rituals and prayers and fires, and perhaps feasting as well.
Really?
All to do with sending your soul to that place where it can't do any more harm and where the community is cleansed.
And Miranda also believes that other rituals linked to sacrifice, such as removing the soft tissue from a corpse, can leave marks on the bones too. But the condition of the bones from Slipgill remain a challenge in the battle to resurrect a compelling scenario for how these people died. Caroline's colleague, Dr. Chris Ryan, has the task of reassembling the head of the adult male before he can start work on his face.
Here we've got all the fragments reassembled into approximately the shape of a skull. And as you can see, there's quite a large chunk of the right-hand side of the cranium missing, and some of the facial skeleton. But we can, because we have the left-hand side quite intact, we can estimate much of this by mirroring parts of the skull from one side to the other. The green is just estimation of all the missing parts. There's not enough of the mandible just to mirror it, because we only have this chin area and 3 teeth.
The next stage will be to add layers of muscle and skin. Soon the face of the man who died at Slipgill will emerge. So, if our people at Slipgill were sacrificed, were they members of the local community or were they outsiders? The team hopes the stable isotope analysis of the bones could shed some light on this. If chemical signatures from the teeth and bones are consistent with those found around the Yorkshire moors, then it will indicate the skeletons were born and then lived in the local area. This could support Miranda's idea of community sacrifice. Sue assembles the team for the results.
What they basically showed was very good quality sample, typical grain-based diet, almost no marine. Okay. So that's quite interesting. What it also showed was that they were local to the area. Now, the particular band that they fall closest to is actually very localised to where they were found.
It makes it more likely to be ritual than just vindictive.
Yeah, I suppose it does.
Our Slipgill people were locals, and there was possible violence around the time of their death. But if they were human sacrifices, did they offer themselves up willingly, or were they executed? Despite the evidence that's now building, Sue is reluctant to conclude a theory of foul play until she has more proof.
We're not ruling out the fact that, you know, it isn't necessarily ritual. We're not ruling out all these possibilities, because your imagination could run wild. We're going to try and keep it as focused as we can. That says archaeologists say, got to bear ritual in mind. But what do the physicality of the bones tell us? Is there anything on there that supports this or refutes it?
Until now, the team has focused on the 4 individuals from Slipgill. But 18 more skeletons were found in other Windy Pit's caves around the same area. Sue now turns her attention to some of these other remains.
It's an adult. And a lot of fracturing, so a lot of the joints have actually, where the sutures have sprung. And you can see that fracture again dissipating out into that suture. But a lot of comminutive fracturing going on here, so that the blow is to that point there. So it's coming in round about here. So again, I think we've got evidence in at least the 3 of these of some form of blunt force trauma. This is a male, an adult male.
This damage to these other skulls from a neighbouring cave could mean that the other Windy Pits were used for rituals and sacrifices. And as Sue starts to look at the remains of a skeleton from yet another cave, she notices some even more worrying marks on one of the shin bones.
This is a bit of tibia. This is a bit of the shin bone. It's got a bit of damage at the top and at the bottom. And there's three, or looks like three, parallel lines. Well, those are not natural. They're not rodent activity either. Those look like they could well be knife marks, or at least a sharp blade. These are parallel cut marks. These are a repeat of the same action in the same place. I used to work in a butcher shop before I started my academic career, and I can remember having to take pieces of meat off cow bones and such things, and these are the kind of marks that you leave behind as you're paring away the muscle to take it away from the bone. That may well be. Now, it tends to make you want to go too far, because what you end up doing is you want to go down the sensationalist route, and the last thing that forensic wants to do is go down a sensationalist route. But it looks like muscle's been removed. Why do you remove muscle from a human bone? I don't know. I think we could all surmise.
If these are indeed blade marks, the investigation looks set to take an even more sinister direction.
The word that everybody wants to say is the one that we're not going to say, which is cannibalism, because there's no evidence of that. All you have is evidence of cut marks. We don't know what that meat was being used for.
But nevertheless, it's a chilling turn in the story. Xanthi wants to establish what cutting marks on bone could mean, and travels to Oxford University to meet Dr. Rick Schulting, an expert in prehistoric archaeology.
If I saw these kind of marks on an animal bone, I would think butchery. But this is a human bone, so why are we getting these marks on a human leg bone?
It's unlikely that they were eating the flesh of this person like you would with an animal, because we have very questionable evidence for cannibalism at this time in Britain. If this was in the Neolithic, we might think of trying to deflesh the bones to make them clean as a part of joining the ancestors.
But how does removing the soft tissue from the bones help people go to their ancestors more quickly?
Some people in different times, parts of the world, believe that death is a process, and it's not complete until the putrefaction of the body is completed, and you're left with the clean bones. And at that point, the soul, if we want to speak of it as that, ascends to the ancestors. And sometimes there's an interest in hastening that process by disarticulation and defleshing.
According to Rick, the practice of removing flesh is unlikely to be a sign of cannibalism, but was a way of allowing the dead to cross over to the next world. But there were also more sinister explanations.
We have to be open to various possibilities. Some of them might deal with negative side of things, the dark side, if you will. And there is some evidence for slightly strange and odd things going on with human remains in the Iron Age in different parts of Britain that sometimes involve taking the body apart and moving bits of it around. Usually the skull especially seems to receive special treatment.
So the cutting marks could fit in with the idea of ritual dismemberment after death. But how would the marks have been caused? To find out, Xanthi and Rick head to a local butcher's.
My femur is just about free. Let me just take off the last little bits. Now, actually, you can see I've left some marks. Actually, look, all along that edge, you can see all of my butchery marks going on there. Would I use a tool like this to get rid of the rest of this soft tissue, which I've kind of left behind?
Possibly, but the other possibility is that a stone tool might have been used, which we know people were still making and using in the Iron Age.
So kind of scraping it. That would save my knife, I guess.
Yeah. I do have something with me here that we could have a go with, if you like.
Save your lovely sharp blade.
Okay, it's not necessarily the sharpest or most appropriate, but it does have one nice edge here, and you'll get a sense of what it's like to use that.
Right. So I'm just going to hold this nice and steady, I guess, and then just scrape the soft tissue off. You need to actually get a good hold of it, don't you? There we go. That was actually pretty efficient, isn't it? I'm quite impressed, actually. It's much sharper than I expected it to be.
and that's where a lot of the muscle attachments are actually joining to the bone, just around the ends, and that's of course exactly where we saw them on the human bone.
Exactly, you can actually see now, look, I've left some really quite deep grooves there.
Oh, those are brilliant.
Yeah.
Xanthi has produced exactly the same marks on the pig bone that she found on the human leg bone. And Rick wants to demonstrate one very specialised type of defleshing, removing the skin from a person's scalp.
All the way up, yeah.
All the way up.
But why would you do that to a human head?
Well, the head is very important in many societies, and we have a very good case for it being important in Iron Age Britain and Iron Age Europe in general.
Are there any examples from the UK where the soft tissue has been moved from the head?
There's a few cases. There's one from a Romano-British context at St Albans, where they seem to have had a defleshed head placed quite near a temple complex, actually, which maybe starts to speak again of why you're doing this. The idea of trophy heads, or possibly as a punishment. We have another case up in the far north of Scotland on the Moray Firth, where again we have a child in this case.
Oh, really?
It looks like the skull has been cleaned back, so they're interested in this, having this white, clean bone to display, presumably.
So it's really rare then?
It is. There aren't that many cases. So again, it's not a normal practice, so it's a very special person or somebody that's done something terribly wrong or being made an example of, perhaps.
Xanthi has discovered that defleshing the dead was practiced in Iron Age Britain. Sometimes it was associated with funerary ritual, but maybe it served another purpose. Human skeletal remains recovered from windy pits show that some individuals most likely met a violent end, possibly as part of a ritual sacrifice. We know that at least one person had their flesh cut from the bone, before ending up in a cave waiting to be discovered thousands of years later. Until now, all the people whose bones were found in the caves on the moors have remained anonymous. But finally, the face of one of them is taking shape. The adult male from Slip Gill.
Well, our biggest problem with this skull was that it was in multiple fragments and we didn't have very much of the mandible. So Chris has done a fantastic job at reconstructing the mandible from just a bit of chin, which is remarkable, and managing to get the whole of the cranium together in lots of pieces is also quite a difficult job. And then from that, it's the same process as it would be for any reconstruction. We're just building the muscles and putting the skin on. But so the biggest challenge really was the state of the skull. Well, let's have a look at the skin then.
And he's turning into an interesting looking individual.
Wow, that's not what I was expecting to see at all. He actually looks quite masculine, really. And I wasn't expecting him to look that masculine. Because the top of his head is quite gracile, really, isn't it?
Yep.
And then he's got this big heavy jaw at the bottom and really small ears. Why really small ears?
Small ears, small nose, height-wise.
I quite like him.
Good.
We've got a pretty reasonable face out of really quite badly conditioned skull.
The completion of the facial reconstruction marks the end of the investigation. The team will now report their findings to the local community. Xanthi and Sue have come to Duncombe House, not far from the Windy Pits. They're here to return the skeletal remains to the local archaeologists and to present the case results. Although they've made great strides, Sue is concerned that they don't have enough evidence on the bones to confirm that the man of Slipgill was sacrificed.
Xanthi's gone away and done a lot of historical research with a lot of people who know a lot about this area. So we've gone back to the Slipgill skeletons. We've had a look through them again, just to be sure, just to be certain.
Sue looks at the Slipgill remains one last time.
So, do you have a minute?
And she notices something on the skull of the adult male that they missed before.
I don't know, but this is left parietal. Okay, so that's sitting there. Can you see there's one line cut mark along there?
It's quite deep.
There's another one below it.
Yep.
and there's another one below that.
Sue has found several parallel cutting lines around the top of the skull.
You've got a cut mark that is, if I turn you around a bit, you've got cut marks that are coming here, and then you've got some that are back there.
It looks like Sue has detected signs of scalping on the adult male. As Xanthi discovered, this practice of removing hair and skin from the top of the head did happen in Iron Age Britain and may have been part of ritualized killings. For Sue, it's enough to finally bring the events surrounding the death of this man into focus.
I'm not a great supporter of defleshing and sacrifice and ritual, all sorts of things, as anyone will tell you that knows me. But sometimes when you're faced with information and you go through all the possible outcomes, sometimes there's only one left.
These findings will have an even deeper significance for the local community and the experts who've been studying the remains for decades.
We've actually waited a long time to get some more information about the remains from the Windy Pits, so this is very important.
There's lots of unknown questions that hopefully we'll get some answers to today.
Sue and Xanthi explained the twists and turns in the case that led to the conclusion that this was not a natural burial.
Did they go up there knowing what was going to happen to them? Or did they go up there in some way incapacitated?
All of the caves, they're not being used as a kind of a normal deposition site for burials. So why are people going up?
Caused by that, because it does fit in there really rather nicely.
Then the moment comes for Sue to announce her last-minute discovery.
It takes an incredible amount of persuasion for me to want to talk about sacrificing people to gods and placing them down portals so they don't come back. It just makes me uncomfortable. But then this morning, we had a look a little bit closer at some of the areas as we were laying out the skeletons. And we came across something that we hadn't noticed before. And it was all to do with this man. On this man, and on his head only, we have evidence of defleshing. So we have scratch marks. We have parallel scratch marks that are of a similar width in various parts across his skull. They're very, very delicate, but they are there. Now, if they're defleshing, for whatever reason they're defleshing, they're only defleshing around the head, almost in the sense of a scalping, because the defleshing isn't on the face, and it isn't on the back of the head. It's just around the area of the crown.
So they put a blade in it and just scrape.
The cutting marks on the skull are the final piece of evidence that at least one of the slip-gill skeletons was almost certainly ritually killed. It's a terrifying story.
We've placed him into an environment which is a really rather scary, spooky sort of place that must have had some importance in the local community. He's been taken there, he's been perhaps immobilized, he's been murdered, one can assume, whether by one people or by a community, and then he's gone through a ritual removal of his scalp. So his scalp has been scraped away.
But now, it's time for the team to reveal the face of the man whose life ended in such violence.
Because we have only one skull, there was only one face that we were able to reconstruct. So do we want to see what he looked like? Yeah, go on then.
He's got quite a rugged face, hasn't he? He certainly looks like he was a pretty robust individual, doesn't he? He's, you know.
I quite like him. Slight asymmetries in the orbits.
Quite high, defined cheekbones.
If you were walking around Helmsley today and saw someone looking like that, I mean, you wouldn't look twice, would you?
When you think what he may have gone through. And you have to ask, why was he chosen? What was so important about him? Was it because he was important in the area that's why he was selected? You know, we will never know. That is really about conjecture. But what we do know is that he suffered blunt force trauma. We know that his skull was defleshed.
Following the story through and hearing more about it today, it's been absolutely fascinating. It's really filled in a lot of the picture.
That was really amazing, absolutely fascinating. I thought the facial reconstruction was wonderful.
The actual face brought it all very much home. You know, he's a very human face, and why did they do to him what they did?
And the possibility remains that the other skeletons found with this man also met the same tragic end.
We've added a dimension to this that we never anticipated we were going to. And in fact, it's a first for me that I've never been involved in something that has involved this sort of a ritual, if you like. It does still make me uncomfortable because I really don't like the words. But at the end of the day, the bones have the evidence, and the evidence speaks for itself.
The human remains presented to the team were not a recent discovery. But it took modern forensics to bring back to life a tragic story that's 2,000 years old. At Dundee's Centre for Anatomy and Human Identification, the History Cold Case team prepares for an astonishing new case.
The archaeologists have asked us to come in and assist on some of the cases. It's the one that nobody else solved. It's the one that's your challenge. Can you make a difference?
The investigation will be led by world-renowned forensic anthropologist Professor Sue Black, while Dr. Xanthi Mallet scours the UK for historical evidence, and Professor Caroline Wilkinson rebuilds the faces of the dead.
I've got a team that is of world-renowned reputation.
This case will take the team back nearly 2,000 years to a time of invasion and great upheaval in Britain.
Today's case, which is Roman Bulldock. Oh my goodness me. There's a female found buried with 3 babies.
This is an unprecedented archaeological find. The remains of a woman and 3 babies, discovered in a sinister position within a single grave.
It doesn't look so much disrespectful as careless to me, yeah.
Rushed.
By forensically reconstructing the fate of this woman, can we gain crucial new information about why she died? And how will her story change our views of the past?
It's very difficult because it's very easy to kill a baby and leave no marks. Yeah.
A time of brutal medicine.
It looks pretty vicious.
That is for perforating the skull.
And rife superstition.
You were getting ghosts. If you take the head off, you know that person's not going to cause you trouble.
When survival was far from guaranteed.
As a result, all of them, all 4 of them, have died. This is the kind of story that will resonate with anybody who's a parent.
That's basically infanticide.
The History Cold Case team has come to Bulldock, a Hertfordshire commuter town with a hidden past. They set up their mobile forensic lab on Clothall Common, where people have lived for over 5,000 years. Iron Age remains have been uncovered around here, which suggest Bulldock may be the earliest town ever to develop in Britain. Members of the local archaeological community are laying out a selection of skeletons found here in 1989. This investigation will focus on the troubling remains from just one of the graves, a female buried with 3 tiny babies in what looks like suspicious circumstances. Who were they? And how did they all end up dead in the same grave? Dr. Xanthi Mallet is on site first. She meets archaeologist Keith Fitzpatrick Matthews, who supervised excavations of the area and called in the History Cold Case team.
There's actually a late Roman cemetery under the tent. There's a temple over there, more burials over there. So we're really in a necropolis almost.
The dating of the burials to the Romano-British period is so far based on artifacts found in the graves.
One of the graves had this rather nice little 1st century AD jar, and because it's a fairly early style, we can be certain that most of the graves were of the Roman period, so it puts it very early on.
Keith takes Xanthi to the nearby housing estate, where the female and babies were unearthed.
Now this looks very suburban, but I guess it didn't look like this when our burials were in place.
Absolutely not. When we were excavating here, this was open land. It had been farmland for centuries. This is an aerial photograph taken when it was still being farmed. The site of the burial is just there, which puts it underneath those garages opposite.
So, we're really close.
We are very close indeed.
The archaeologists thought they were excavating the body of a man. Then the dig took an unusual turn.
Once we'd excavated his grave, it became apparent there was another grave underneath.
Oh.
And beneath his head and shoulders were the head and shoulders of the woman who was lying at right angles to him. That's where things started to get really interesting, because once we were uncovering her head and upper chest, that's when the first baby turned up.
As the dig continued, it became clear there was a second, then a third set of infant remains in the grave with the woman. Finding 3 babies together in a grave this old was an unprecedented discovery. Professor Sue Black flies in from Dundee HQ to see the remains for herself. They're hoping the bones will provide answers as to whether this is a 2,000-year-old natural tragedy or in fact something more sinister. Sue immediately notices that the skeletons appear to be remarkably intact, which is promising.
They're very good condition.
They begin their analysis on the first of the 2 boxes containing the remains of the woman.
Ooh. Okay. Christmas. Who knows what
opening Christmas parcels. Yes, it's definitely a lady. Look at that. It's very feminine. My goodness.
Gradually, they start to build her physical profile.
Oh, it's a very short tibia. That's very short.
I had to see how tall she would have been.
So with the tib, we're talking, it's coming in at 31. So 31, it's coming just short of 5 foot. So it's coming into the sort of 4 foot 11 sort of range.
4 foot.
So very short. So S1 and S2 are fused. So we're over the 20s barrier. We're probably up into the 30s barrier,
yeah, but
you know.
Teeny weeny legs. Apart from that, no pathologies or traumas to
Very feminine pelvis though.
So we're happy female, happy adult, young adult.
A woman, only 4'11" tall, in her mid to late 30s with no obvious cause of death. Then there are the extraordinary remains of the first baby.
Oh my.
Oh wow. Oh!
We are in severe fragments. That is a tibia.
Is it?
It is.
I'll take your word for it.
Thank you. That is It looks like humerus. It's very difficult to tell. These are vertebrae. Look at those. Aren't those beautiful? It's like, you know that game of jacks you used to play? That's exactly what they look like when they're like this.
So cute, aren't they?
Look at this.
Reading bones this small and this old is incredibly difficult. And there is a second tiny skeleton.
That's my 7683. Oh, there's a lot less of this by the looks of it.
And then the third, recovered from the same grave.
Oh, now this one's much better preservation. Look at that. Relatively good condition.
That's pretty good, actually.
I have to say the recovery is just
amazing,
fantastic.
It's amazing, first century.
Although Sue is a world authority on juvenile anthropology, she has never faced a challenge like this before.
You can't tell if they're boys and girls.
No.
Because they're not born pink and blue, which if they were would be nice. Forensically, the things that we look for are any injuries on any trauma, anything that may have shown that, you know, the child has been dispatched, as it were. But again, it's very difficult because it's very easy to kill a baby and leave no marks.
Yeah. It's quite an interesting one, isn't it?
Who was this woman? Are these her babies? And if so, why would a mother and all three babies end up dead and buried together? The team will need to gather every bit of forensic evidence they can muster to prove exactly what happened here. Scientific testing gets immediately underway in the mobile lab. A sample taken from the thigh bone of the woman will be used for carbon dating to confirm whether these bones are indeed from the early Roman era. The same sample will also provide a chemical profile that can reveal where the woman was from, as well as crucial information about her diet. And adult and baby bones are also sent for DNA testing.
The only way we're ever going to really know whether these individuals are related is if we can extract any DNA. They're in a good condition, but they're not in a perfect condition. So I think we have to be realistic that it's possible we might not get DNA samples from them. But if we do, confirming that the DNA of all three babies matches would be fantastic. Matching it to what we think is a female skeleton would be even better.
Alongside rebuilding the woman's face, this battery of tests will help create a profile of her in life that will be crucial in cracking this mysterious case.
There are so many questions to be answered in this case. Who was she? Why was she buried in that way?
In the meantime, Xanthi's task is to initiate the historic investigation. If our woman lived and died in Bulldock nearly 2,000 years ago, what kind of town could it have been? She meets up with Dr. Jeremy Taylor, an expert on Romano-British history.
So we're looking at kind of first century Bulldock. What would it have been like?
Bit of a Wild West town.
Oh,
yeah,
really?
Certainly at that particular point, yeah. Probably were. Because until they settled down and local government was organised in towns like this, you know, these places, the rules are changing very, very rapidly, and civil government is only becoming re-established in the aftermath of the conquest.
So thinking about it, you know, as if we can see Roman Bulldock in front of us, what kind of people are using it in first century?
They're a magnet for people from all walks of life who are coming as traders, artisans, craftsmen, following in the wake of the Roman army and Roman administration, hoping to make a living.
So she could have been from anywhere, doing anything, in essence, then?
Pretty much, yeah.
It's not what Xanthi wanted to hear. Although our woman could have been a local Celt, she could also have been a Roman from literally anywhere across the empire. The isotope results will hopefully help to pin this down. None of Bulldock's Roman buildings remain. But below the surface of this football pitch are the foundations of what was once a huge temple in the centre of town.
Oh, excellent. Oh, look at that.
On excavations of temple sites, we find chickens being sacrificed, but also sheep, sometimes pig. Oh yeah, certainly animals, can be. Sheep and goat certainly are sacrificed. This is a centre of religious life here. People come from the local area, but also people who are travelling on the Roman road between the major cities are also going to be stopping here.
And there's a good chance then that the woman that we're looking at would have actually visited this site.
I think it's very likely that she would have come here at some point.
That's exciting.
Bulldock in the 1st century was clearly a volatile place, rife with religious superstition and clashing cultures. Could the new Roman cult religions that increasingly dominated this area after the conquest in 43 AD have played a role in how our woman and the infants lived and died? First, the team needs to find out whether she even lived during this period. Back at Dundee HQ, Xanthi joins Sue and Professor Caroline Wilkinson to hear the results of the carbon dating tests, which are now back.
We're looking at the carbon dating. Previously, the only thing that was dating it was the grave goods, so we had context.
They didn't do carbon 14 before?
No.
No.
The carbon dating covers a span from 6 AD to as late as 215 AD.
So that's right bang in the middle of when the Romans were kind of officially in Britain and coming to. So there's a lot of moving about at this time. So she could have come from anywhere. She'd come with Romans, literally, anywhere.
We don't have the isotopes yet?
Not yet, no. So that's going to be quite interesting. And we don't have the DNA yet either. So that's the first actual kind of hard scientific evidence we've had come back in. And it agrees with exactly what we'd been expecting anyway.
We like it when things agree. Not everybody does, but we like it when it agrees. Yeah, makes me feel comfortable.
Yes.
These results place our woman and the babies firmly within a time frame when Bulldock was under heavy Roman influence. By 215 AD, the Romans had brought their entire culture to Britain. Legal and political systems, architecture, a vast network of military highways, as well as their social attitudes and superstitions. When the woman's grave was first excavated in 1989, it was singled out as different from the other burials on the same site. But was this only because of the presence of the babies?
I've actually got a visual that I can show you from the information we've received from the archaeologist, which will really help actually. It's one of these lovely CGI moments. So this is looking at the graveyard.
Under these roads?
Yes.
And where's the rest of the cemetery?
The rest of the cemetery is actually partway kind of down here across the road on the other side. What we're looking at there is the male that's overlaying, and then we'll go down a layer. So you can see the baby over the shoulder, the second infant, and the third.
It does make you think about things in a slightly different angle. With Mum being laid on her side, is that telling us something about how she's viewed?
I don't know. If you look at the male, I think what's interesting is he's on his back in what you'd kind of expect, lying. Well, she is placed differently. I don't know how important actual physical position was at that time, whether that in fact means quite a lot that she's placed like that.
There is something odd about the position of the woman's skeleton that's making the team uncomfortable. Xanthi returns to Bulldock to discuss the burial site in more detail with archaeologist Keith.
So we're going to have a look at some of the images now, aren't we, from the actual grave?
Yes.
I'm quite looking forward to seeing these. I think they're going to be quite intriguing.
So there she is, laid out in the grave.
This looks unusual to me by the fact that I would expect, correct
correct me if I'm wrong, just to be lying on her back?
It is relatively unusual, both in terms of where it is in the cemetery and in terms of the way that the body was laid out in the grave.
Okay, where it was in the cemetery, why was that unusual?
We're on the edge, almost on her own, not quite, but it's very much a peripheral position within the cemetery. She's also been laid on her right side. There aren't any in precisely this position. This is a one-off.
Is there a kind of a descriptor for this?
Because of her unusual position, we would tend, as archaeologists, to describe this as a deviant burial. Not meaning that there's anything deviant about her as a person, but that as a burial, it falls outside the statistical norms.
So literally unusual.
Unusual, and socially perhaps a bit unacceptable.
Why was she not given a normal burial? Was she herself judged to be deviant? And if so, why?
I don't know if you can make out up there.
Oh,
That's the baby by the right shoulder.
I can just see it in there.
In a deeply superstitious society, could it have been that she was somehow deemed responsible for the death of the babies, which might explain why they were all buried together?
That's sad, isn't it?
It's very, very sad.
A key part of the woman's physical profile will be provided by Caroline's facial reconstruction.
Quite a strong brow for a woman. And the good news is we've got some nasal bones, which means that we can predict how much her nose projects. There we go, so that fits there between the orbits.
Caroline always begins with a close examination of the skull parts, especially complex in this case, given how old and fragmentary the bones are.
It's quite useful to be able to slot some of the pieces together before we scan them. When you do it by hand, you can feel how they slot together as well as see. The mandible is quite square chin, square jaw, so quite a masculine-looking woman, not typically female.
She captures the fractured pieces using a 3D laser scanner, as the skull will be reassembled in the computer. It will take several weeks to bring the face of this woman back into view. But will it turn out to be the face of a social outcast?
The suggestion is that this woman is dealt with almost as if she's a deviant in some way. Is that supporting the suggestion that perhaps they're outsiders? The whole thing just smacks of a bit of disrespect. And I guess in today's society, I don't quite understand why that should be.
To find out more about whether our woman was considered different, Xanthi travels to London to meet Alison Taylor, an authority on deviant burial in Roman Britain.
Hi. Can you tell me a little bit about deviant burials and what that means I'm presuming she's Roman period anyway.
Right, yeah. Looking at what we call the deviant burial, might have been someone that they were a bit worried about.
Worried about?
Somebody who they may think the spirit would have walked and caused damage, somebody who was a bit outside the normal
so something
for some reason. So somebody whose ghost you might fear for some reason, maybe just because that person was very unfortunate.
And Alison knows of some bizarre attempts to stop people coming back from the dead.
This one looks a bit odd.
Yeah. This one has her legs are resting on a horse's head.
I wondered what that was. There you go. And then her legs are actually placed on top.
On top.
But Alison believes deviant burials from Romano-British times took two main forms. The first, decapitation.
Quite a number of people did lose their head It seems to have been done usually straight after death, and there are cut marks on the neck.
Yeah.
And we do know from, sort of from later accounts of this sort of burial, is that if somebody was giving trouble, you were getting ghosts, if you take the head off, you know that person's not going to cause you trouble.
And the second main type was known as a prone burial.
There's a very long tradition of that being seen as very disapproving. Get that in lots of different cultures, lots of different periods of history, right through the Middle Ages, that can be done to certain people. It seems that what they really don't want is this person getting out of the grave to go and cause trouble haunting. So if you're buried face down, if you do come back to life and you want to get out, all you will do is go deeper down.
This would seem to match our woman. What does Alison make of her burial position?
She's obviously highly unusual, but I would say that this would not classify as a deviant burial.
Really?
In any of the normal classifications.
But she's kind of leaning forward, but you don't think that's a deviant action?
Well, it's not face down.
No.
She's buried on her side, and her legs are slightly bent. I think she is simply buried in what was almost a comfortable sleeping position.
Surprisingly, Alison actually thinks this is the normal burial of a heavily pregnant woman.
She's just laid in the ground in the most comfortable position. I think you couldn't have buried her face down. If she was heavily pregnant, it doesn't bear thinking about. It was probably the most practical, easy and traditional way of treating her.
Alison believes our woman was probably not an outcast. She was buried on her side, with all the respect afforded a pregnant woman. But this is the first historical evidence that a pregnancy may have been involved, and none of the babies appeared to be inside the woman. So was she pregnant or not? Back in Dundee, Sue looks for clarification from the bones.
One of the questions often asked is, are there indicators on a skeleton of a woman who's been pregnant? Is there anything left behind? Of course, most of the changes are soft tissue changes. We used to say that if you can see that groove there in one area of the pelvis, so this is at the back of the pelvis, we used to say that's an indication the person's been pregnant. We've completely thrown that out the window, but it would make an awfully nice story if we could say, just because that's there, we know she was pregnant, and that's not the case. So it would be awfully nice if we had something on here that said, oh yes, there's a clear indication this was going to be her 24th pregnancy. There's nothing.
The mother gives no clue, but what of the babies themselves?
Maximum length. But of course, when you have multiple pregnancies, often the babies are a little bit smaller. It's term, 40 weeks, it's a newborn baby.
These 3 babies are aged around the time they would have been born, making it highly likely this is a mother and her 3 babies. Astonishingly, as they're also all of a similar size, it's probable they were from the same pregnancy, making them triplets. Only the DNA results will be able to prove this beyond doubt, but it brings the bones alive for Sue.
Those are 3 full-term babies. These have gone to their full duration, maybe not quite 40 weeks, but close. And if you imagine the connotations that has for her, being a little woman, not of a very young age, carrying 3 full-term babies, the implications for her and for the people around her, that's a huge story.
It's a crucial turn in the investigation. This could be the oldest archaeological evidence of triplets ever discovered. To find out more, the team must now shift its focus and view this as a multiple pregnancy. Only 1 in 80 pregnancies is with twins, and only 1 in 8,000 is with triplets. In ancient Rome, successful multiple births surviving to adulthood were generally seen as a good omen and became part of mythology, like the twins Romulus and Remus who founded Rome. And there was even a heroic set of legendary triplets, the Herati, known as the champions of Rome. But what were the chances of our mother giving birth successfully to triplets in Roman Britain nearly 2,000 years ago?
How were women treated in difficult childbirths in that time? How did they deal with that? What was the mechanism? What was the medical background available to help her? Was there anything, or was she just on her own?
Xanthi travels to the British Museum in London to meet curator Ralph Jackson, a leading expert in ancient Roman medicine.
Wow. What kind of level of understanding do they have of the anatomy?
Well, this quite good in the kind of harder parts, but not too good in deep inside, in the profound and softer parts.
So more superficial anatomy, they
Exactly
were
so.
quite au fait with.
Bones and superficial anatomy, simply because there was no dissection of human cadavers. This was not routinely done. So internal anatomy was patchily understood.
Ralph has a wide array of surgical tools used during Roman times.
But it seems like quite a range here. This is what I would expect almost to see in like a field kit now, an emergency field kit, just having a quick look.
I think this is one of the amazing things. When you look back and you look forward again, you find that the instrumentation hasn't changed hugely. In the kind of basic kit, you have knives,
Very similar to
surgical
scalpels
blades,
today.
scalpels, with a huge range of different types of blade. There were a range of probes, and then sharp hooks used for retracting the edges of wounds and incisions. They are precision-made tools, beautifully finished.
Some instruments would even combine the practical with the divine.
Over here, a folding handle for a drill includes the sort of mortal side, if you like. It's a precision tool, but at the end there is a bit of decoration. It's a snake head. And why would you find a snake head on the end of a drill? It's because the snake was the creature of Asclepius. Asclepius was the great overarching healing god. And if you put his creature on the end of your tool, both the operator and the patient would feel reassured.
This is a real combination.
It is a real combination of divine and mortal healing.
This toolkit, is this a medic's toolkit or is this a midwife's toolkit? And was there any difference?
I suppose there was a difference. It is a medical kit. It's a basic kit of surgical tools used for all of the routine surgery. The midwives certainly could have had instrumentation, because although midwives, by definition, tended to look after women expecting babies, they also were expected to have knowledge of other aspects of medicine, and that included surgery.
Our pregnant woman in Roman Bulldock could have had surprisingly advanced medical care available to her.
We had people who came to Britain with written texts that talked about medicine, and some of those will have been connected to childbirth. So we can't deny the possibility of knowledge of classical medicine, the texts, the techniques in Roman Britain, and not just in Roman Britain, but in Roman Bulldock.
Yet something went terribly wrong. All three babies, along with their mother, were in the grave together. Why? In Dundee, Caroline has now reassembled the skull of our 4'11" woman.
So you can see here she's got quite a prominent lump above her eyes, quite a strong brow for a woman. We've also got quite prominent bone surfaces here. It suggests she didn't have small, delicate ears. She may have had quite large, prominent ears. I think she might have an interesting face, but I wouldn't go as far as to say she's going to be unattractive. I think that might be a bit harsh.
With the skull reassembled, only the green areas are missing, which can be estimated by mirroring the opposite side. So what effect would pregnancy have on the woman's face?
Well, often when women are pregnant, they become fuller of face, and usually later in the pregnancy it's more noticeable. But that's based on contemporary pregnant faces, and obviously we're well-fed and pampered in relation to people from this period of time. So I don't know how much of an effect her pregnancy would have had on her face.
If the isotope results come back that she was well nourished, then it raises the question of why a healthy, pregnant woman would end up dead, along with all 3 babies. The team now hunts for clues in the baby's burial positions.
The larger baby that was...
When excavated, 1 baby was found underneath the woman, 1 between her legs, and 1 near her shoulder.
It doesn't look so much disrespectful as
Careless.
to me, yeah.
Rushed, careless.
Oh, I don't know. I don't know.
I just don't like that. I don't like a baby up on her shoulder, because you wouldn't bury somebody with a baby there.
No.
You just wouldn't. I think that's an afterthought. It's just an odd placement. One of the babies was found at her shoulder, and I don't quite understand why you would do that. You would think if you were burying a mother with her baby, it might be across her chest, it might be in her arms. There's almost an element of discarding.
Is there a cause of death that could explain why all 3 babies ended up dead and appear to be almost discarded? Xanthi goes to the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists in London to meet Dr. Helen King, an expert in Roman birthing and childcare.
Helen. Hello.
Helen offers a shocking possibility for what may have happened to the babies.
In Roman terms, there was a ceremony after birth where the father of the child had to pick the child up from the ground. If he did that, it indicated the child was worth the rearing, is how they put it.
So the father decided
yes.
how the baby was treated?
Absolutely, and whether it's exposed or not.
This kind of idea of exposing a child, what's that?
Well, exposure means that you leave the child to die after it's been born. And I think, although it sounds pretty weird to us, I think in Greek and Roman terms, that's just really a very late abortion.
That's basically infanticide if you just abandon a child.
In our terms, yes, it is. As far as they're concerned, at least you found out what you've got. You found out the gender of the child, whether it's healthy.
Oh, so physical disability.
That's right. But also, interestingly, how the pregnancy went. And if the pregnancy was a healthy one, then that's more likely that the child's worth rearing.
It's possible 1 or even more of the babies could have been the victims of infanticide, their bodies just dumped in the grave. But Helen knows of certain Roman birthing techniques that could also have been responsible for the babies' deaths.
Do you know what that is?
Well, my imagination is telling me nothing good. It looks pretty vicious.
It's vicious. That is for perforating the skull.
To kill the baby.
It would kill the baby, certainly, but it would also release the material inside the skull. And what you're trying to do is reduce the contents of the skull.
So you'd kind of pierce the skull through the little soft part,
Yep.
kind of mash the brain around.
That's the sort of thing.
To break it down, so the baby would pass out more easily.
So with a head presentation where the head's got stuck, it's just a very large head.
This is what you would do.
That's what you'd use, absolutely.
So basically there's no chance of a baby surviving with that one?
No, but there is a chance the mother would survive, whereas if you left the baby there...
The mother's going to die?
Certainty,
yeah.
yes,
okay.
exactly. And then there are these, you know what that is?
I do.
Oh, go on then.
This would go in through the same soft area on the top of the head and basically hook the baby out, wouldn't it?
That's pretty well it. Or you could also do it through the eye cavity.
So
or
any
through the
orifice?
Mouth. Yes, anything you can grab, really.
Yeah, depending on...
To pull. Yeah, exactly.
That's pretty nasty, isn't it? I mean...
Well, it is, but if the alternative is the woman's going to die, then this could be a lifesaver. This baby here, this is actually where the head's been left behind.
Oh, nice.
And you're grabbing into the mouth and then exerting traction from there.
So this is where it's gone wrong at this stage.
It's
we've
gone
got
terribly wrong.
fragmentation and they're literally just extracting what's left of the baby.
Yes, exactly.
It's a great image, though.
But we do know that the Romans had access to texts which talked about using hooks to extract babies that are in a difficult position. So if she does come from a Roman background or has access to Roman help, she could possibly have had that sort of instrumental interference in her delivery.
Are there any signs of intervention in our case that would indicate midwives had to deal with a difficult birth? In Dundee, the bones of the 3 babies and the woman are put through a CT scanner. This will look outside and inside the bones to reveal damage that can't be detected just with physical examination. Sue then analyses the results with her colleague, Ruse. First, they look at the female's scans.
The pelvis is like a basin, and it's a basin that's wide at the top and narrow at the bottom. What we haven't got intact is the bottom end. I don't think there's enough. So she's not going to tell us.
The female's bones are strong and healthy, but show no signs of intervention. What of the babies?
But you see, the trouble is there's no skull there. There's really nothing. It's tantalising, isn't it? There's nothing that suggests really there's anything going on there. We can't tell from this that she's had any obstetric assistance of any kind.
Again, there are no marks on the bones to indicate use of Roman instruments or medical assistance.
There's no evidence on the remains of the babies of trauma of any kind that might be associated with somebody trying to assist the birthing process. So mum's not helping us with the birthing process, the babies aren't helping us with the birthing process.
It's a frustrating situation. But can the woman's remains help to shed light on this in another way? Chemical traces in her bones could reveal whether she was Roman or Celtic, which may in turn suggest what type of midwifery she would have had access to. The results of the stable isotope analysis are now back.
We don't know the genetic relationship yet. We're kind of obviously postulating the babies are hers. But I do have the isotopic results. So it's going to tell us about their diet, their provenance. So this is really all hinging on, are they Roman or are they local or what? Because that's going to have a massive impact on the whole case. Her diet is standard terrestrial, very low marine, which is exactly what you'd expect for around that area. So it's unexciting, but it does pin it down.
A mixed diet.
Yep,
presumably with bit of marine, bit of fish, bit of grain.
Yeah, but mostly like the grain element, very minimal kind of marine. In terms of where she came from, geographical banding is looking at southern England and through to the central western area. Again, it corresponds with Bulldock. So in terms of diet and provenancing, she's local.
If our woman was from a local tribe without access to Roman medicine, it was far more likely she would have had to try and give birth without intervention. Is natural childbirth to triplets now the most likely cause of death for this woman? To find out just how dangerous it is to try and give birth to triplets naturally, Xanthi goes to Queen Charlotte's Maternity Hospital in London, which deals with more multiple births than anywhere else in the country.
Hi, Xanthi. Nice to meet you.
She meets Chief Obstetrician Dr. Sailesh Kumar.
Hi, Charlotte. This is Xanthi.
Hello, lovely to meet you. I think we're here today because you're having a scan, because you've got 3, aren't you? Triplets. That's right.
Yes, we're going just to check the growth of the babies.
Dr. Kumar is performing a health check on Mother Charlotte, heavily pregnant with her own triplets.
How far along are you?
25 weeks and a few days.
Triplets grow at the same rate as a single baby, putting much more pressure on the womb.
Do they kind of fight for space?
I know they kick each other.
So this little one weighs about 753 grams. And all the measurements are equivalent to about 25 and a half weeks, so pretty much spot on.
One of Charlotte's babies is in breech position, meaning feet or bottom down, a much more difficult position to give birth to a baby. How normal is this in triplet childbirth?
Is that what you'd expect with triplets? Is one
Yes.
being breech?
Yeah. It would be unusual for all 3 babies to be head down, because there's a limited amount of space within the uterus. So frequently you get one baby head down, the other baby lying across, perhaps the third baby in a breech, in a breech position.
So carrying triplets, you'd never give birth naturally?
Well, you never say never, but it would be highly unusual these days to deliver vaginally.
It's too dangerous?
Yes, yeah.
Charlotte's triplets are progressing nicely, but there will be major medical intervention, including a caesarean section to help her give birth.
All three babies seem to be doing well, Charlotte, and I'll just let you listen to baby's heart rate.
But what of our mother and her 3 full-term babies 2,000 years ago in Romano, Britain? In Dundee, Sue has gone back to the bones for one final examination. One of the babies becoming stuck in the birth canal, known as breech position, is the biggest threat to life in triple births. Yet, according to their positions in the grave, none of our babies were found in the birth canal.
So the overlays that Zant showed us in the briefing that came from the archaeologist are here, and if we just have a quick look at those. This is mum laid out in the burial outline. If you put the babies then, the rough position of the babies, the first one is sitting here towards her shoulder. The second baby is sitting down in here, between her thighs, a quite unusual place to find a baby. Quite difficult to explain what that's about.
But critically, Sue now believes the position of the second baby, previously thought to have been born and outside the mother, is misleading.
Now, if this baby is found outside mum's cavity, you have to say, well, was the baby born? And not necessarily. Because if what happens, mum dies while baby is still trying to be born, then obviously that baby stays within the pelvic canal, within the birth canal. As mum decomposes, inside her gut, she creates a lot of gas. And a lot of gas inside her actually causes a rise in pressure inside her abdomen. And she can expel the baby after she's dead because of the rise in gases. But because the baby's decomposing as well, it's much easier now for it to get through the birth canal as well. So that this found outside mum doesn't mean that when she died, it was outside mum.
If the baby was stuck in the birth canal, only to be expelled through what's called a coffin birth, this could explain how that baby and the mother died. And there's another revelation. Sue believes that baby number 3 was not found merely under the mother, it was still in the womb when it died.
This little person here, nobody ever knew it existed. Because this one was still waiting to be born. This one was still in the queue. This is their secret child. She wouldn't have known it was there. We're the only ones that know that this baby existed.
And the breech birth that killed the mother and 2 of the babies could also have indirectly led to the death of the baby that was born, found on the mother's shoulder.
If she'd already had one of the babies, that baby would have survived her. But of course, if there isn't anyone to feed that baby, then that could have been an extra problem. But also babies who aren't with mum are in a very, very dangerous position.
Even if this baby was born alive, without its mother, perhaps the odds were against its survival, which might explain why it too ended up in the grave along with its siblings. So all 4 deaths could have come from one breech birth. And Sue has an astonishing X-ray from the 1950s that graphically illustrates exactly how a breech birth could have had such fatal consequences.
It's a full-term fetus. So there's the baby's head. There's the baby's vertebral column coming down there. There's its leg, or one of its legs, sitting up there with a foot up here. Babies don't bend well in the middle, they really don't. That width isn't going to go through there. There's no space in there. No. And there isn't, and that's just with one that's gone to full term. Now you imagine you've given birth to one already, head down and off it's gone. You've still got this one in here in this kind of a position, and there's a third one in line still waiting to come out. Well, she's not going to do it. So that she's going to spend 2-3 days in labour, desperately trying to push out, getting weaker and weaker the whole time, and eventually she's going to die. And as a result, all 4 of them have died.
It's a tragic scenario. But until the DNA shows beyond doubt that the babies actually belong to the woman, it remains unproven. But who was she? The isotope results have already shown the woman grew up in the local region. So if she was from a Celtic tribe, what were the likely circumstances of the pregnancy? Xanthi goes to the bathhouse at Segadunum near Newcastle to meet historian Lindsay Allison-Jones, an expert on the lives of women in Romano Britain. The tribe local to Bulldock were called the Catabalani, and there is evidence of how women from this tribe may have lived, including a surprising array of birth control options.
Oh, it's vinegar. It is, and that, if you soak sheep's wool in vinegar and use it as a vaginal pessary.
Would it have worked?
That would have worked, yes.
It wouldn't have smelt very nice.
No, it wouldn't, but perhaps slightly better would be the olive oil, and this, which is alum.
What's this?
Oh, this is a mineral which would have been ground up and used as a paste within a pessary. If you'd stuck to it, if you'd made sure that you were using it properly and you always did it, then it would have worked.
According to Lindsay, these techniques and the fact that our woman was in her late 30s make her pregnancy unlikely to be a mistake.
Do you think the woman in Bulldock would have been married then?
Oh yes, most people would have been married. Celtic law saw a marriage between a man and a woman as a partnership, and that they would go through life as life partners.
Well, that's very romantic, isn't it? You kind of imagine they would have had loads of children running around everywhere.
No, what is very interesting about life in Roman Britain is that the evidence suggests that they are controlling the size of their families, and most families are having just 2, max 3 children.
Would it have been a shock, do you think, because she's that much older to be a mother?
It is quite late to be having children in the Roman period, and it may be that this is the result of a second marriage, because second marriages were quite common.
But who might she have been married to? Surprisingly, Lindsay thinks it could have been the man buried just above her.
The fact that they're actually one on top of the other at right angles and very closely aligned, I suspect, suggests that this is her husband who knows exactly where his wife is buried and wants to be with her.
So it wouldn't have been an accident that somebody would have been buried above her?
I don't think it was, no.
It's a real surprise. Was this man her husband and the father of the children? For Sue, it's an intriguing possibility.
Is he involved with her? Does he have any relationship to her at all? We don't know. But what we can do, if we're lucky, is get enough DNA out of that material that says, can we match DNA? And we're back to paternity testing again. Gosh, you know, we're in the news with paternity testing right now. So, you know, here we go, Roman paternity testing. Could he have been dad?
A bone sample from the male was also sent for DNA testing. Meanwhile, Caroline is close to discovering what our woman may have looked like.
You can start to see her face developing in terms of the overall position of the features and the overall shape. And because she had a normal, healthy diet, that doesn't suggest that she was emaciated. So we're keeping her at normal stature. Because of her pregnancy, she may have had a slightly fuller face, but she's already got quite a square, rounded cheek look to her anyway. I think she might have a really interesting end product face here.
The case is now reaching a close, with only the key DNA results still to come. The team goes back to where the bones were found in Bulldock to reveal the details of their investigation to the local community. Keen to hear their findings are those who originally excavated the site, experts who have assisted the team, and members of the local community.
It's going to be really interesting to find out the results of the scientific tests. It's quite exciting because we've never had anything like this done with the stuff for Bulldock before.
Often, as an archaeologist, when you look at skeletons, you do dehumanise them. So having the facial reconstruction is really an important thing.
To me, this is absolutely what the fusion of history and science and archaeology and medical history and literary studies is all about. This is where it's at.
The nightmare scenario would be discovering that the mother isn't the mother of the triplets.
Feel free, come and have a look. What you're looking at is special. In fact, it is unique. And we've been very privileged to be allowed to look at these remains. We think we've got some very interesting information to tell you.
Sue will reveal what the science has brought to the case. But how will those who've lived with the bones for over 20 years react?
The carbon-14 dating that came back for Our Lady was between 6 and 214 AD. So our individuals are unquestionably in the early Roman period. What the isotopes tell us was that in terms of their diet, these are local individuals. They are local to Bulldock. But she's in her 30s. She's a late mum. She may well have been very, very heavily pregnant. She's gone to full term, she's gone the full distance. Wow. And she was only 4'11". There's a lot of weight in there.
Yeah.
But what of the DNA? Will these final scientific results prove a familial link between the woman and the babies?
There's good news and there's bad with DNA. I have to admit, looking at the quality of this, we said on the day, chances of getting DNA out of this are extremely slim, which just shows how much we don't know. The DNA from baby 2 matches with the DNA from baby 3, which matches with mum. We couldn't get any DNA out of baby 1, which is just so unfair. But what's the chance that that baby doesn't belong? It's highly unlikely. It's got to belong to her.
The woman was indeed the mother of the babies, but was the man the father?
So, paternity testing? Couldn't get any DNA out of it. I'm so sorry.
It's a remarkable story of a mother's struggle to give birth to triplets 2,000 years ago.
It's about the journey that she has gone through in an event that most of us take for granted will result in something that is terribly happy and terribly natural and will be just fine at the end because that's what we're used to. Her story isn't quite as successful, but it is incredibly important.
Finally, it falls to Caroline to reveal the mother's face.
To be able to see her face is really quite amazing.
She's striking. She's definitely striking.
Yeah, she's very capable looking. The face of a good childbearer. You heard it here. I like her though. There's something engaging about her.
But her story's complete. And in the completion of her story, then it's the closure of the case. And I think that we've gone as far as we can.
I'm thrilled. Getting those results is just amazing. It couldn't have been better.
She couldn't survive that with the sorts of conditions she was living in, with the sorts of help that was available to her, and that's very striking.
It sort of rounds off a story that was started 20 years ago, and a mystery and an enigma, and it's given us a vast new amount of information. I think that's great.
This case started with a skeleton assumed to be a social outcast, maybe the victim of a suspicious death. But it's ended with the profile of a local, healthy, and probably married woman. strong enough to carry 3 babies to term, but in the end the victim of a simple human tragedy, pregnant with triplets in a time when the odds of surviving were stacked against her. These extraordinary bones will now be handed back to the community. The only ever recorded case of Romano-British triplets is now closed.
It is a sad case, but boy is she important when it comes to recording how we handled these kind of multiple births. And that story has come from the remains. So we feel very privileged to just have the temporary custodianship of them so that we can work with them. From this point forward, her story will be remembered.